Planning Commission, City of Wilsonville for Wednesday, October 10th, 2018 is now in session. Will the clerk call the roll, please?
Chair Greenfield.
Here.
Vice Chair Postma.
Here.
Cameron Mesbaugh. Phyllis Millen.
Here.
Simon Springall.
Here.
Rob Huberlein.
Here.
Peter Hurley.
Here.
Thank you.
Please rise for the pledge.
I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
This is the time in our meeting that we have the opportunity to let members of the audience, citizens of Wilsonville, address the Planning Commission regarding any item that is not already scheduled for a public hearing tonight. We have one such matter, which it is our intention actually after opening to continue to next month. At that time, there will be ample opportunity for a full hearing by the Commission. If any member of the audience would like to speak about any work session item or any other matter of concern within the Commission's purview, please raise your hand so that we may hear from you now. Very good. We'll move on to consideration of the September minutes. Are there any corrections or additions that need to be made? Hearing none, the minutes are approved as distributed. We move on to a legislative hearing on the Boons Ferry Park Master Plan. Matters before the Planning Commission involve a legislative public hearing such as this. These are somewhat different from the quasi-judicial hearings conducted by the city's Development Review Board. The Planning Commission would like to hear from anyone who has testimony to offer that is relevant to the issues before the Planning Commission. If you wish to testify tonight, please fill out one of the cards on the table at the side and make sure that it is given to our recorder. Because your testimony gives you legal standing in the matter for which you're testifying, it is important that you provide your full name and address on the testimony card or at the beginning of your comments. When you testify, please address your comments to the criteria that will be reviewed by the city staff at the start of the hearing. Some of the issues that come before the Planning Commission are fairly complicated. For that reason, we especially appreciate any specific recommendations or suggestions that you may have. We will ask you to avoid redundant testimony. If you agree with testimony that has already been given, just tell us that. If we have a large number of people interested in testifying, we may have to limit the time allotted to each. I don't see that as an issue tonight. When you come to the microphone, please state your name and your address, or if you prefer not to state your address aloud in the public forum, state that your address is as provided on the testimony card you submitted for the record and speak into the microphone. At the end of your testimony, members of the Commission may have questions for you. And thank you very much for coming out on this beautiful October evening to help us deal with these issues. We'll move on then into the hearing. It opens at 6:04, and we will hear from the staff presenter.
Thank you, Chair Greenfield. I'm going to invite Mr. Mike McCarty up to the dais,
who is requesting the continuation on this item this evening. Mike has been working with some technical experts, and there are some last-minute refinements to the plan. Last month, we talked about the hearing that would be occurring tonight, and Mr. McCarty is requesting that the public hearing be continued to the date specific of November 14th, 2018, our next Planning Commission meeting. And we will do our best to get the full plan distributed early, as we discussed last month, since the commission has not seen the full body of text for the Boons Ferry Park Master Plan. So it'll be our goal to endeavor to get that to you in advance of 7 days prior to the hearing. For the public, the plan will be posted on the city's website 1 week prior to that public hearing. And in the meantime, if there are any questions or concerns, Mr. McCarty is happy to try to field any of those questions from the public in the interim. I'm sorry if I just took all of your thunder, but I just wanted to set the stage for you, Mike.
Way more eloquently than I would have done, but really nothing more to add than Chris said, except for we will have it to you early. We talked to the consultants today. They will have us the final rendition by next Friday, so there's no reason we won't get it to you plenty early. I do need to apologize that we haven't got this to you sooner. Our whole intent, I think it was June or July, and obviously that ship sailed. But we want to get you a product and a document that you're proud of and we're proud of and the city taxpayers are proud of. And with that, I would like to continue it till November, and I hope 99% it won't go by that. Okay, so it'll be here in November. Thank you.
Thank you. I do not have any cards from those who wish to speak. Last chance until next month.
Excuse me,
yes.
I know I just see Mr. Benson, who's on the Parks Board, and I probably might be a surprise that it's being continued tonight, Mr. Benson. If you had testimony, the commission can receive any testimony tonight, and then we would close the hearing following any citizen testimony, put all of that testimony in the record for the council and commission's consideration next month. So if anybody wanted to speak tonight, you can.
But if there's modifications in the plan.
Right. Right. So he said if there are modifications, he hasn't seen them, so probably better off not to comment on a plan that's in flux.
Very good. Then do I have a motion to continue?
So moved.
Second.
Those in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Mr. Hurley? Yeah, okay.
And that's just to clarify, that's a date certain of November 14th.
Then the hearing is
Correct.
Yes, thank you.
Correct.
a date certain of November 14. Being no opposition to that, the hearing is continued until a date certain of November 14, 2018.
Thanks, Mike.
Thank you again.
We move on then to, thank you. Then we move on then to our two work session items of the evening. The first is the town center plan, and Ms. Bachel will present.
Thank you, Chair Greenfield and Commissioners. We last saw you 2 months ago where we had an updated draft town center plan that had received community comments, task force comments, and we started getting into some of the details, including design and development questions that we received your help on. And so tonight we are back to talk to you in more detail, give you an update on where we've been over the last 2 months, what's been updated, some new elements that you'll see in your packet, as well as updated elements. And then we're also going to highlight the development feasibility analysis that we mentioned last time we'd been working on, and that will be a topic of an event tomorrow that hopefully some of you are attending, as well as traffic analysis. So that's about all I'm going to cover at this time. I'm going to introduce to you Jennifer Scola on my right, Associate Planner with us, and Alex Alex Dupy, Director of Planning Services for MIG, the consultant who's assisting us, who's going to walk us through this presentation. And as we did this last time, this is a discussion, this is a conversation, it's a work session. We have a number of questions for you that are in the staff report that are also sprinkled through the presentation as we go through each of these elements. We want to get input and direction from you for the next draft that we'll bring back to you at your November meeting. So with that, Alex, do you want to take it away?
Sure. Thank you. Thank you very much. Thanks for having us back in tonight. Miranda, can you hand me thank you. So we have a fair bit to cover. As Miranda mentioned, we do want to step through the draft comprehensive plan amendments as well as the revised zoning standards and design guidelines that we've put a lot more effort into to get visuals, kind of key maps to put together to make that more of a full-fledged document. I do want to step through the feasibility analysis, but I want to make sure that we get to the end with traffic analysis because that is a critical component for the success of this plan overall. And Scott Manser, who's behind me, will come up for that. So we do have a lot to cover, but as I'm going through this, feel free just to ask questions as we get through it. But with that, so we have 4 major elements to talk about. I do want to talk about draft implementation measures as well. We're starting to put some of those ideas together, so we'll have some ideas about that to get your input. A lot of that's going to come from our task force meeting on the 23rd, where they'll actually be prioritizing some ideas, and we'll come back to you with that, with a refined set of measures and strategies at our next meeting. But let's start with comprehensive plan. So since we last met, we've gone through the Wilsonville comprehensive plan and identified several changes that would be needed to implement the town center plan with the current document. And part of that is some cleanup, just to make sure that town center is noted throughout the document. We've done that in a red line strikeout version, so you can see where all of those changes are. But we are talking about a new town center designation, which goes with the zoning and design guidelines that we talked about last time. So we've added a section on town center to incorporate a town center designation within your comprehensive plan. And that essentially would replace the existing designations within town center now. Which is I believe is commercial. So this would be a consistent designation that would implement the zoning and design guidelines that we've talked about. It's generally, in terms of amendments, it's a pretty straightforward amendment. It's a new section with just a few changes to the table of contents and others to identify where that is. Specifically related to the development code and design guidelines, we've taken your input from the last meeting, as well as added in some things that we had talked about that you knew were coming, which primarily are maps, some visualizations on what, for example, different buildings could look like, types of or percentage of window coverage, street design, pieces like that to actually start to flesh out those development codes. But specifically, some of the requests that you had earlier on that we've updated include more focused design guidelines on Main Street, but leaving some of the other areas a little bit more open, a little more flexible to allow for different types of development, but really honing in on that Main Street component to make sure we have solid pedestrian quality and solid design standards for the buildings. We did update the floor and height requirements. We had talked about whether allowing one-story buildings would be acceptable in some areas, and we got pretty clear direction from Planning Commission that we should look at least 2 stories. So we've amended that section for town center. But then also done other things, looking at off-street parking recommendations, which I'll go through in just a moment. Added a little bit more detail for some plaza and design standards, but essentially just kind of fleshing out some of those things that we had before. One of the questions for Planning Commission was, what does an alley look like, or what does that vehicle access look like for accessing parking lots, and how is that safe for pedestrians? How do you make that a safe interaction? And so we've developed additional street cross sections to be able to show that. And those specifically are not in the design guidelines, but will be in the plan itself to provide direction for that. So we didn't quite get to this at the last Planning Commission meeting, which we talked briefly about parking, but we didn't talk in detail about specific changes or requirements that we should consider for town center in terms of parking requirements. So I wanted to step through just briefly what the current standards are within your parking standards and how that relates to the type of development that we're looking at. In terms of multifamily, that is based on a per bedroom with no maximum. And so if you have, a one bedroom or a studio apartment, that's a different requirement than what a 3-bedroom would be, for example. Multiple tenant buildings require the sum of all uses. So if you have retail, restaurant, office, and residential, you're essentially counting up all of those spaces that would be required, and that is what you would have to build for that building. But you don't have any mixed-use standards. So, what's the definition of a mixed-use building, which is a lot of what we've been talking about in this project, and how does that relate to parking? So I think those are two key pieces, is you have no requirements for mixed-use buildings, but if you're looking at developing mixed-use, providing parking requirements that match the type of use that you're wanting to attract is that kind of that rub in terms of where we look at for parking requirements. Some things that are good within parking right now is that you allow shared parking, which is essential for the type of land use that we're considering for town center, particularly as the area develops over time. We know that there's a lot of parking in town center now. Are there ways to use that existing parking to support future development? And then that parking could develop over time, but maybe could still stay parking if you allow it to be shared with adjacent uses. So continuing to support that. You also allow on-street parking to be counted towards your standard, which is great for small businesses, particularly in mixed-use buildings. And so that would be something that we would recommend continuing as a part of the town center parking standard. One of the caveats with that is that you don't have an exemption for small-scale retail or restaurants. So that can be tough, particularly for mixed-use buildings. If you have 3,000 to 5,000 square foot retail spaces, having to provide that parking space either to the back of a building or on top, it's tough if you could just as easily park in front of your space or in front of your space. So it's something to consider as we move forward for these different types of uses. So those are your existing standards. Our recommendations based on what is happening in the region is to look at a mixed-use building standard. So rather than counting up that sum of all parts within a building for your parking standard, consider that if you're mixing retail, residential, office, or whatever uses on the second and third and fourth stories, that there should be some type of reduction for the parking requirement, particularly if you're looking at office and residential, because people are not there at the same time. So, allowing a reduction for those types of buildings. And what we've seen in other areas like Hillsborough, Tigard, is that they reduce that by about 25%. So allow a 25% reduction for those buildings if it's mixed use. Right now, for your shared parking, for your off-site parking, you have I believe a 500-foot maximum in terms of allowing that space. We suggest removing that maximum distance to really take advantage of those other spaces that are within town center now. So use the existing parking lots, but don't limit that to where existing or future businesses or residents can park. We suggest removing the per residential, or the per bedroom requirement for parking, and just do a flat one space per dwelling unit within town center. And we know that there are some challenges with how that's functioned in the past. We've heard that some apartment buildings have multiple tenants, multiple people living in a single space. I think that the idea is that if you still allow increased parking, so don't change your maximum necessarily, but if you do allow a reduction in the minimum, there is so much adjacent parking available that you could take advantage of those spaces for now until the area densifies, and that you can start to consider something like structured parking. And that's something that many other jurisdictions are doing across the region, is to try and manage that parking supply and not overbuild it. And then lastly, and important for particularly Main Street and mixed-use areas, is consider exempting small retail businesses within mixed-use buildings from the parking requirement. So, for example, exempting retail spaces of less than 5,000 square feet, which is essentially the Starbucks that you have, coffee shop, small restaurants. Allow those to use on-street parking, but don't require that that's a part of the mix within your existing parking requirements, particularly for restaurants. Restaurants from a traffic generation standpoint, if they're large destination restaurants, can require a lot of parking. That's not the type of development we're talking about here for these smaller spaces. So requiring them to build that actually makes it difficult for them, one, to be financially feasible, but also it requires generation of a lot of surface parking that wouldn't be used for development or other types of services. So some tweaks to your parking are using a lot of the existing pieces that you have, but making some changes with the understanding that this area, will transition over time, particularly with the different vision that you have for town center compared to what you have today.
Before you jump over,
sure.
A couple of them, I guess I wanted to pull on a little bit. So removing the distance maximum for offsite parking. So looking at the way the attachment A3 has that in there, is it meant to convey that within the town center zoning district you can have offsite location anywhere, or is it meant to say that if you're in the town center, there is no distance limit to how far your offsite parking could be? Could it be outside of the town center zoning area, for instance, across the pedestrian bridge, and you've got a gigantic parking structure over there? I want to make sure I understand what the language is supposed to convey there.
That's an interesting question based on a conversation we just had with SMART about 3 hours ago. So the idea would be that each building would still require a certain amount of parking on site. And the number of one space per dwelling unit has become a bit of a standard for more mixed-use types of areas. We're seeing analysis done throughout the region that places like not even central Portland, but outer Portland are achieving parking ratios of 0.7, or sometimes even lower. But we acknowledge that, one, there are different amenities within Wilsonville, but even some of the suburbs are getting less than 1. We think that 1 for town center would be appropriate. In terms of the distance, that's certainly up for debate. If you wanted to put a caveat on that, it would not be limited to 500 feet, but within town center someplace. A developer could lease an existing surface parking lot and use that for overflow until it would develop, essentially a land bank for that. But from SMART's standpoint, they said, when the pedestrian bridge is connected, why couldn't we use our 40% full parking garage for overflow parking if we connected it well with transit? So I think there's, at least from their end, they want to support higher transit usage and would be willing to use their facilities that are underused right now for parking to actually support development within town center. Am I characterizing that correctly?
Yeah.
So I think that's a question: is do you allow that distance just within town center, or do you allow it to be located someplace else? I think the goal is to try and right-size parking as much as possible so that you're not overbuilding and essentially get the same type of development pattern you have today, which is a lot of parking that's not used.
While he's chewing on that, can I throw another one at you? You had mentioned before, I think you said Beaverton and Hillsborough have reduced their off-street parking by 25%. Is that right? Is that the two jurisdictions there?
City of Tigard, for their downtown standard, has a mixed-use standard where if it's a mixed-use building, they allow a 25% reduction within that building.
So how's it performing there? Do we know?
So they just have some new mixed-use buildings coming online, so it's something we would want to evaluate.
Okay.
But I think the idea is that they're trying to maximize the amount of building footprint while still providing on-street parking, but acknowledging that the more uses that you can fit into a space, would hopefully reduce the amount of parking that you would need for people to come in and go out. But that's certainly something to look at what's happening with Tigard and how that's functioning.
Yeah, and like Orenco and stuff like that, have they done anything with that or not, or is it?
A lot of Orenco, particularly the newer developments, the recent Holland development, they built a structure and they went one dwelling unit per unit within that, but I'm not sure exactly how.
One spot per unit, you mean? Okay.
One spot per unit. But
So we don't know how that one looks either.
A lot of with parking is that there's not a magic bullet to it. So you try and right size it as much as possible to provide flexibility. I think the benefit with town center is that you have a lot of available parking now that could be used early on. Even if you're reducing parking minimums for future development, there's still a lot of parking available to use as overflow until it develops where you could do structured or those types of uses.
But then who would fund the structured parking? I mean, if you've got all the initial development or half the initial development that's land banking and using existing surface lots, does that mean the second half of development is going to pay for that structured parking? How does that work?
We will get into that when we talk about feasibility.
Okay.
And the short answer is that structured parking, Hillsborough, other locations, it's rarely a public agency that's building that. It's often either a partnership with a public-private partnership, or it's paid for on the private side. So looking for a parcel, for example, for a city to purchase and then build a structure is a risky proposition given what we know about parking and the changes in parking. So often those types of developments are public-private or privately funded over time.
On both of those points, one project that I do know about that has come up in a lot of the conversations with you and City Council is the Lake Oswego parking structure that has a wrap format where all of the shops are kind of on the outside that a lot of people like. I know when that project was put in, it called for more parking spaces than were constructed. There was a study that was done about utilization of parking rates in downtown Lake Oswego to help inform them in their decision-making of what is the right number that needs to go in based on this mixed-use project, and there was a reduction in the initial requirement of spaces. So when there was an initial requirement that basically essentially added them all up, they went, I believe it landed between 20 and 25%. And I think most of us at least have, what I've heard stated in our discussion so far is that that's a good example of parking. And then related to that on this second question, remind me what the second question, funding, that was essentially funded in part through the city's city's urban renewal, and then also through folks basically paying into a bank. So rather than having to build their own spaces, they put money in per space essentially, and then that went into the fund to help pay for the actual structure.
Okay.
Is that Lake Oswego garage though really performing well? I mean, it is just my layman's experience with it is it's not. It's often full, and they've reserved so many of those spaces that it becomes problematic for people coming to visit the retail locations and the like.
I would say, in my experience, I've always been able to find a spot, so each person's experience is different. Yeah. But what I would say is I do think that the over-dedication I think
that's probably its bigger problem.
I think the over-dedication is the bigger problem, and that's something that came up at council too, is in one of the areas of town center, we actually have spaces that are marked for this business only, for this business only. Yeah. And that's, I think, when you get into more trouble, because what we're trying to do is support this mixed use. You park once, you go to a bunch of places, so you should, that sort of isolating to the exact business might be sort of the bigger problem that we're experiencing, and that maybe time limits, certain spaces are for shorter visits. That could be something that's a bit more beneficial. But a fully utilized parking structure, I would argue, is also successful.
Yeah. No, I agree. I agree with that, and I actually think you're right when you're saying it's that over dedication to certain of the businesses, because it's not a problem. Is like I said, it's patrons who don't have an opportunity to go somewhere because one business has got 5 allocated spaces and 4 of them are empty, and it doesn't do anybody any good. Next thing you know, you're walking out with a parking ticket, and I've paid more than a few of them, so that's how I know it's not performing the way it should. My bank account will attest to that fact. But I also then wonder what kind of strain that has on the on-street parking. And do you correct that by putting time limitations on the street parking? Because my experience is that what will happen is if they're not performing properly, you're going to get people who are just going to park on the street and they're going to be there for days on end, especially if you have residential, right? Somebody's going to go away for the weekend and their car's sitting right in front of the Starbucks for, half of a week, and that doesn't do anybody any good either. So I don't know what the solution is.
Well, that's first, you want that problem. I mean, not the problem that people are parking there, but you want an active, you want to have parking so people can come and go to the businesses or shop or do whatever it is they want to do. But with that, as on-street parking is a critical element for, a main street, a successful main street. But with that often comes parking management. We just did a project for the city of Renton, Washington, where they have an active downtown. Their biggest issue was exactly what you said, where employees were parking right in front of their business and they were camped there all day long. And then they were saying, well, there's a parking problem. It's like, well, no, the parking problem is that your employees are parking right in front of your business and there's no enforcement to make them move after 2 hours. So part of an implementation strategy, as you get to that demand, is to actually develop enforcement of on-street and off-street parking if it's public. That's something probably further down the road, but certainly something as the area becomes more active, you would likely need to address at some point. And that's not uncommon for urban areas.
Thank you. So I'm interested in this concept of managing the parking supply over time, and the funding in the longer term. But we also want to bear in mind the general concept of concurrency, which is in a sense that some businesses may be profiting. If we're not careful, some businesses that come later might be profiting or conversely paying more than businesses that are there earlier. And yet we have to trade that with wanting to encourage development in the earlier years. So I don't really have any solutions, but I'm interested in seeing a little bit more detail on the concept of managing the parking supply over time and how that can be done in a business-friendly and development equitable way, if that even makes sense.
No, that's a great suggestion. I think the Lake Oswego example is actually a pretty good one, because that was the first corner in a revamped downtown Lake Oswego. It took a long time to get that project going. What the right size amount of parking was, how it was paid for, how it's managed over time. Those are all issues that they're starting to deal with now as development comes in. But yeah, that was the first project in that used both private and public money. But how do you deal with that over time as the area matures? Yeah, certainly something to consider.
Wrapping back to offsite parking, because I think I finally put my thoughts together. I guess the concern I have is, for me, Lake Oswego works because the parking is there. Mm-hmm. I'm concerned that if we say, okay, you can have off-site parking at Smart, but we'll be happy to provide a regular shuttle service, that you will discourage people from coming to that area because it's not convenient. Right. And so the other thought is town center is pretty big. I mean, that area is large. And so if you say, okay, somebody in the southwest quadrant doesn't have parking there, but they've leased parking in the northwest quadrant, you've got a good distance that those people are theoretically going to have to travel to get from parking to the businesses. And I'm just not sure if that makes sense if we're trying to encourage people to be there to provide an opportunity for a significant distance for parking.
Sure, and that's a great point. I think I want to clarify that the expectation is that you're not going to be parking necessarily across I-5. Say development were to come in tomorrow, their first option is not going to be to use the Smart parking lot. I think the question would be Fry's, for example. Essentially, that parking lot to the south of their building is more than 500 feet to the edge of their property on the other side. That's the same. It's the same parcel or series of parcels, but by providing some flexibility and to think more at a more of a master development scale as opposed to just a single site scale. That's, I think, what we're trying to get at. But maybe we should put some more thought into what that right distance is if there should be modifications to that. I completely get your point. You know, it's somebody's not going to walk a mile to their car, and that's certainly not something that we would, you know, recommend. It's more just looking at some flexibility for future development.
Yeah, I think the flexibility is good. We just need to do a little more work.
But the right size it. Thank you. No, that's a great point.
Yeah, and this doesn't take away from it, but just in terms of remembering the scale, if you're in the center, it's about a quarter mile in any direction. So across all the way is probably a little bit more than a half of a mile, just to get a sense of scale of where you would go. And this wouldn't prevent, I mean, there would still be parking required, and parking, I think would some of it need to be required on site, or are we saying?
Yeah, there'd still be requirements for on-site parking. I think it's really more the spillover. If you have a tight site and you can make your pro forma work and your financing will allow for that, providing some options for people to you know, be a little bit more creative in how they work with that. At least initially, you know, as more development comes in, then it will get tighter. But that first person in should, you know, if they're going to take a risk, you know, give them some options to try and be successful.
In coming up with flexibility, I hope you will not undermine the investments that the city is making in the other systems. Mm-hmm. We are investing in our transit. Mm-hmm. Well, if everybody can just drive to the store and pop in and pop out, nobody's going to use the transit. We're trying to create a transit-oriented and walkable town center. And part of that is to make it pleasant so that people can walk. But by designing it as being heavily car-oriented, we're going to undermine all of our investment in these other modes of getting to the stores. So the flexibility needs to address different uses and different populations. Mm-hmm. A person who wants to pick up a dry cleaning on the way to work needs to be able to find a 5-minute parking and pick up their suit. But somebody who's coming to do kind of window shopping and so forth doesn't need to just go from store to store to store in their car. Okay. And the design needs to be crafted so that it dissuades people from doing that. Not in a nasty, snarky way, but in a way that encourages them to park in one place and either catch a shuttle and get in and out wherever they want, so that if a mile is too long, there's a mile-long Champs-Élysées in the middle of Wilsonville. You can drop in and out as you're coming and going. It's part of the system. So I look forward to the kind of a nuanced approach to the parking.
Yeah, and I think part of that is what you require in terms of parking right now. Again, your current standards have gotten you know, what your existing, you know, land use pattern or urban pattern is within town center. I think the other piece, to get more specifically to your point, are what the urban form requirements are for where parking is located, particularly along Main Street and other areas, so that, yes, we need to provide it so that people can come in and enjoy it, hopefully park once and stay, but two, when they're walking around, it's a pleasant experience to where they don't mind walking around, or they, you know, they don't want to get back in their car because it's safer to drive from one side of the parking lot to the other than trying to walk there. And so I think you're absolutely right. There's a balance there, but making sure that parking's in the right location and that it's accessible for the right types of uses, whether it's 5 minutes or 2 hours.
And I think it was an interesting conversation today that we had with SMART, and the fact that we have our own transit system that can be very nimble and flexible definitely is going to be something that can support this plan and support, if we make some of these decisions and go in this direction, can really support those policy decisions. We had a very exciting conversation with them today just in terms of talking about changing technology and different options and the ideas of the, you know, shuttles within town center and being able to really access different parts of town center very easily and be able to kind of be picked up or dropped off potentially anywhere based on those new technologies. So I think that's an asset that we really have that other cities, particularly in this region, don't have. So that's something we should just keep in mind as we're going through this process, and what we'd want out of transit enhancements or investments, things that we can put in the implementation part of the plan to work towards on the transit side that can help support some of these other policy decisions.
Any other questions on parking? We have many other things to cover, so I want to make sure we can step through it. All right, well, we'll be coming back, so we'll continue to talk and refine about this, but this is a great conversation to help us refine these specific pieces. All right, so just a quick couple questions. So I think we might have talked a lot about the second bullet on parking, but in general terms, with the comprehensive plan changes and the modifications we've made to the development code and design guidelines, are these getting to where you need them to be when we start talking about getting into the draft plan and actual adoption in early 2019? Are there specific things that we need to address that you feel are not part of that package at the moment?
This has been fleshed out a good deal since the last time we visited the area.
We've been doing some work, for sure.
If you wanted specific comments on the code, there was some language that I just couldn't understand about mixed-use parking, and it was in page 141 of 267 in our books. So it's got a section number 415502 points D and E. And this was the multi-use parking. But the code revisions just didn't quite make sense to me. So do you find what I'm talking about?
So, go ahead.
Is this a section that refers to essentially, in the event several uses occupy a single structural parcel of land?
Yes.
Except for those uses within a mixed-use building in the town center zoning district where parking requirement shall require 75% of the cumulative number of spaces required.
Right, so there's two excepts in that sentence. So I'm not sure with the second one is except to the first, or so it's just the language. You've got an exception following another exception. So maybe
So maybe we should clean up the language just a little bit. Yeah. I think the idea behind that was just what we had talked about as a 25% parking reduction for mixed uses within a mixed-use building. We were careful not to state that citywide, unless that's a way that you want it to go. But we were trying to focus primarily on future development within town center. But we can clean that language up to make sure that it's more explicit.
The very next section, section E, is kind of similar, but a little bit different. It's about the owners of two different parcels or two different uses, it says, may utilize jointly the same parking area.
So that, so go ahead.
That could also be read to apply to mixed-use parking, depending, because it says owners of two or more uses.
Certainly, and that gets to the shared parking discussion that you're essentially permitting shared parking as long as the uses don't overlap or that you have a parking study to support that. So that we didn't change that because we would certainly want to continue that through town center. So that's just your existing standard.
And the combined parking requirement in that case, if you're talking about section E, that's the greater of the two rather than the sum of the two. Is that right? Or rather than the 75% or anything?
So with that, I would say that it's two landowners that want to share their parking space regardless of the type of building in there. Section D would set the requirement for the number of spaces by the building. So if, say, you had a single-story commercial building that had the parking requirement, whatever that is, and then you had a mixed-use building that gets a 25% reduction, that's what you would use for the parking for that space, and then you would add a shared parking component to that. Am I stating that correctly?
Mm-hmm.
So there's two, there's the number and then there's the how it's used.
Okay. Okay.
We had, I see in here in a few spots that it's speaking about drive-through lanes, and it's prohibiting them. Well, first of all, the first thing is that it's prohibiting them on mixed use. And I guess that makes sense to me, except for I look at the southwest corner there, and I wonder if that's designated mixed use, if that makes a bunch of sense. I mean, that might be some marketable property for something that has some sort of drive-through there. But then in addition to that, I thought it was a little bit strange that when we're saying that we're prohibiting drive-through facilities, like for instance, we put examples, banks, and the space requirements, I guess I guess I can envision in mixed use right along one of those alleys or something like that, you know, the right thing, it might work. You know, a single window coffee shop that doesn't have a spaced out menu board away from the window, or a bank that, you know, you drive up and you're just next to the window. I'm looking, guys, I'm looking at page 116 of 267 is where it shows up, but then it also shows up in the code provisions as well. Or I should say in 128 as well. And I get, maybe I'm alone in that, but I'm just wondering if we're, you know, especially in that southwest corner, if we're really limiting things, if we're saying it's not allowed in mixed use. And secondly, is if maybe we're being a little too restrictive, because some businesses may, I mean, maybe if you restrict a queuing lane or something like that instead, maybe there are some small businesses with a single window that might work. I don't know.
So I think yeah, this may be an inconsistency right now, because we do have drive-through standards towards the end for how they're designed.
Right.
I think the question would be, are there, I think that's what you're asking, are there specific locations where drive-throughs could still be permitted?
Yeah.
You know, if it's a certain district, within the Main Street district, you know, we are trying to create a walkable space without
And that
driveways.
makes sense.
But maybe there's some flexibility in other areas that would be permitted. I would say if you do allow drive-throughs, the current drive-throughs that you have are very challenging for a pedestrian, because you're putting the drive-through space immediately adjacent to the sidewalk. So requiring design standards that actually put that drive-through to the side and back, and that, you know, queuing has to happen on site away from pedestrian amenities, that would be something to consider. But yeah, so maybe there's some nuance there in where drive-through is permitted and where it's not.
Yeah, and just something to think about, but I also note on page 128 that it says that the window cannot face any public road, but it seemed to me that maybe, you know, some of these really smaller roads that we're talking about, or alleyways even, that might still be public. It might still make sense. just something to revisit. I don't know if it, because, you know, look, I've gone through many development applications on drive-throughs, and I don't know how this ever works, and it may not be marketable, and it may not, it may be a moot point, to be honest with you, considering what we're trying to be building here, but that all just seemed pretty restrictive, and not sure it was what we wanted. But I have, tell me if you want to address this stuff later, but I have some questions about the setbacks in particular. That show up. And the first question that I had is that, you know, for instance, on the Main Street district, and this is just my lack of spatial awareness, and somebody in the design realm may be able to tell me better, but my understanding is that one of the things that we really wanted to encourage is like that restaurant that's got, you know, a lot of space up front for outdoor covered seating and the like. And I guess when I looked at a maximum of 20 feet, somebody tell me if I'm wrong, I guess maybe that might have seemed a little bit small to me. If you've got a narrow piece, maybe you want a little bit deeper or something a little bit different. I don't know. I could be completely off on that. But then I also see that it has a rear setback of 0 feet as a maximum and minimum. And I wonder if maybe that's not exactly what we want as well. I mean, I can think of some places like in Bend, for instance, along their Main Street, where actually they have some of their outdoor seating out back. And maybe by doing that, we're kind of restricting that a little bit.
So maybe providing some flexibility on the rear setback as well. From a 20-foot setback for the street side, 20-foot setback. That's a, when you start talking about seating, that's a large amount of space. You know, if you imagine that's probably from your dais to dais here, thereabouts. That's enough for several tables and chairs or seating area, in addition to the approximately 12-foot sidewalk that you would have that would still allow for, you know, narrow cafe seating adjacent to the building. I think the key thing with that setback, and there is a requirement there that it's active, that it is programmed. So what you don't want is a cave, nice buildings in a cave going back with nothing, nothing working in there. But maybe some flexibility on the rear side so that things like that have happened. I've seen some great examples in Bend. That's a good location of some rear seating, you know, back end business support, things like that.
Yeah. So while we're on that subject, then it's a couple things on the chart that showed up on that page 122 didn't make a whole lot of sense to me. We have something's not quite compatible here because we have. I mean, if you look at the little. You get the little notes that note number 5 says minimum density applies to residential only development. There is no minimum residential density for mixed use development. But then on number 8, it says second stories or higher in buildings must be habitable. No false fronts are permitted. You know, my first question about that is I guess I thought we were thinking that on Main Street there may be some second floor offices and the like as well.
Certainly, and this is really just to talk about specific types of development. One is that if you have a second story, it could be any number of things. It could be residential, it could be office, but I think the key thing you want is that you don't have one single story building or you get a false 2-story building where it's really only a single story building with a false front. Gresham Civic Center has that, and they've been trying to fix that for years after it went in. The no minimum residential requirements for a mixed-use building essentially assumes that it's going to be multi-story anyways. But I think you do want to have some minimum residential requirements if you have a strictly residential building, maybe on the north portion of Main Street, so that you are getting that density and that quality that the community has been talking about.
Sure, but aren't we a little bit too broad here? We're just saying second stories have to have residential. I mean, 'cause that's how I'm reading that.
So I'm wondering if the word habitable is what's throwing you off, and so maybe designed for occupancy or something of that nature. The idea here is just that we don't want essentially a vacant second story that's not even really a finished space that can be rented, which is what we've seen in other places.
Okay, I think that would match kind of what I was thinking a little bit better. It would take away that them not being compatible.
No, that's great.
As distinct from warehousing up there. As distinct from storage and warehousing.
You know, I think that's a question for Planning Commission. I mean, you could have, if you have a second-story building, say one's built next year, and there isn't quite the office market yet, but somebody's building it on spec, where you have a nice ground floor space, but then you have an unfinished second story that still is habitable. You know, that could be something you could consider early on, because you may get people coming in to develop, but it's not all quite there. So they want that ground floor, they want the space, but you know, they may want to figure out how they finish it out if it goes to housing or office. So that's.
I have a client who's developing a building who's doing that right now, which is in short-term leasing for storage is actually very valuable right now because he knows he can't fill those spaces with other things. So it's actually been something that made it help pencil out until he could really rent the thing out.
I think the key piece with that, though, would be to make sure your facade meets the design standard that you want, so that when it does transition, you can actually do that. So that would be more of a design standard as opposed to a use standard.
And then the last thing I had on that page is actually, I understand the desire to try to assist in the creation of affordable housing, but aren't we, if we're going to say that affordable housing can increase their building height by 1 story, aren't we just going to create a situation where there's kind of a lack of predictability and where some of these building heights may jut higher, or I just worry that I just worry that if we do that, it's going to create some lack of continuity because, knowing how the affordable housing might work and how you might parcel these things out, you might have one in the middle that's just one story higher than everything around it for a little bit, and then you go another half block and there's another one that's, it worries me that might create some incompatibility.
I guess that would be a question on, earlier in the last Planning Commission meeting, we talked more about organic quality, and so heights can certainly be organic. I think the question would be is, do you want a max envelope, or do you want to allow some flexibility if you do get a project comes in that provides some housing? So I think that'd be more of a question for what I had heard, that we were looking more at more of an organic form to do that. But
are there structural implications or the eventuality of adding stories?
Well, they wouldn't add them after development. It would be part of the development. So a builder or a developer would come in and say they would provide a certain percentage of affordable housing with the development. That would allow them the height or density bonus to be able to do that. So they would build it with the project at one time.
The structural implication, after a certain height, you move into much more expensive structures. Is it 5 stories? Am I remembering that right? Up to 5 stories, it doesn't kick the heavy-duty steel structure, reinforced concrete stuff that is necessary for higher buildings.
I believe they're building 5/1 right now with wood.
So the other thing I was going to bring up is, in my experience, developments that have a maximum height, like Washington, D.C., visually very boring because it's just like a crew cut. Everybody goes to that max, and that's where it is. And having the dynamic kind of silhouette gets sidestepped, and that's part of the visual interest that various heights provide in that kind of environment.
Thank you.
But also because of the way affordable housing financing works, we may need to have a standard as to what percentage or something like that, because you can certainly have affordable housing 1 to 2 units in something that's 30, 40 units, and is that going to be enough or not? And maybe it is. We may want to specify, because I know that that's going to be something you're going to address later on.
No, that's a great point. I mean, you want, if somebody does come in and wants that density bonus, it needs to show the benefit for the community.
Right.
All right. With that, can we move on to feasibility? Right. We got a lot more to talk about. All right. So I just want to step through and talk about some of the financial feasibility. Leland Consulting Group just wrapped up a pretty extensive analysis looking at a variety of prototypes, which I'll step through quickly. But I want to tell you what Wilsonville Town Center is right now, and then compare that to some other town centers around the region, just to give you a sense of the land use mix and what other town centers are doing before we step into the actual feasibility itself. So if we look at Town Center now, it's primarily a retail space, a little bit of office, which was built mostly in the last 10 years, some housing, and there's one housing development in Town Center, essentially. But since then, and what has continued to be developed over the last 10 years or so, is really that office product. So most of what's come in is office with just a little bit of retail, which is not surprising because the retail market's been in flux for several years. Offices come in. The ones that were built 7 to 10 years ago. So you're seeing that major piece, but not a lot of development has actually occurred within Town Center recently. But the product that has been primarily office. Now, if you look at the pink and the blue, and you start to compare that to Orenco Station, for example, it's completely opposite. Orenco Station is primarily a residential product with some retail and a little bit of office. And that's continued even with more recent development in the last 8 years or so. It's even more housing with no office, with a little bit of retail to support that. And so when you look at Town Center, Wilsonville Town Center compared to Orenco, it's a completely different environment. And when you look at the amount of housing that is provided to support the retail development within those areas, it's really starting to see that, a lot of retail is tough to support. What you really need is you need a lot of housing to support very focused retail to make it successful. And that's not dissimilar to Lake Oswego, which we've talked about a fair bit. As downtown Lake Oswego came in, it was a bit of an equal split between housing and retail with a little bit of office. It is their downtown. More recently, in about the same time period, past 7 or 8 years, they're still building a bit of retail, but it's primarily housing. That's the focus. One is that that's what the market is right now and has been for the past several years. But what we're finding is that, retail needs people on the ground. It needs people walking around. It needs that support. And so those are the types of products that are being constructed. A lot of these within Orenco and Lake Oswego are mixed-use products. So they're not just the traditional housing or retail. They're a combination of those different types of uses. So I just want to show these as examples, kind of where Town Center is versus where some of the other successful town centers are on the region. Because when we get into development types and when Leland considers some of the feasibility analysis, they look at what the market is doing and how that relates to potential prototypes within town center itself. So when they did their pro forma analysis, they looked at typical pro forma components, costs, programming of the buildings, operating expenses, return on investment, to develop a series of different types of prototypes. And they looked at several prototypes, both with housing and commercial, surface parked buildings, structured parking, wood over concrete, wood structures, a variety of different building types to see what starts to pencil out. And so they did that for housing and commercial. We did that for retail and commercial, but they also did that for office product too, because we've heard that, there is a desire to have more office within town center as well as the other uses. So these graphics that I'm showing are just visual examples of some of the programming they've had within those buildings, but a combination of surface park product as well as structured product for the different types of uses. But also whether land is within the developer, whether they own the land or they actually have to purchase the property, because that's a big cost, particularly if there's an existing structure on there. So as they developed their pro forma, they looked at those different types of programs.
When I look at when I compare these two pie charts for Wilsonville and Orenco Station, clearly the parking load and the traffic are very different for those two arrangements, the contrast between office and housing. Mm-hmm.
It's true, and they do have, Orenco has a lot of parking with it. We saw in the last presentation how they're starting to address some of that. But yeah, I mean, they were built at different times, but it's also where the market is showing and what that mix of properties or that mix of uses are within town centers that people are desiring to be. It's a desirable place for people to be, and that's why it's actually starting to build out now over the last 15 years. But yeah, traffic, I mean, all uses generate traffic for sure. I think it just depends on when it's there and how it flows. So let's step through some of the various scenarios. So they did 8 different scenarios, and if you look at the bottom of each of the graphs, it talks about what those specific products are. Townhomes, garden apartments. Garden apartments are essentially what is there now in the existing development. 3 to 4 story buildings with parking off to the side or the rear. Main street apartments, which are a bit more of a tuck under parking or parking behind the back. Wrap and podium means that the parking is within the building. A wrap is actually kind of what Lake Oswego is, where there's a building wrapped around the parking structure. But then also for retail, what about rehabilitation? We have a lot of existing retail there. Are there ways to, and that's feasible to actually do just rehabilitation for some of these properties, and what makes sense to do that? New build, and then for office, creative office, which is 1 to 2 story buildings, and then mid-rise, which is that 5 story product with structured parking inside. So a pretty diverse mix of different types of uses. Certainly there's things in between each of these concepts, but this gives us a kind of a broad brush of what's feasible and what's not. So as I step through these, you'll see a variety of different colors. So the greens are ones that actually have a return on investment that a developer might look at as something positive. When you get into the yellows and pinks, those are more challenged in terms of development. The yellow product, the yellow could actually happen, but it's really borderline. And then when you get into the pinks, it's pretty hard for somebody to consider developing. And the return on investment is just not there. So baseline essentially is what's out there now, no changes in zoning, or excuse me, no changes in rents, no changes in parking. You own the land, what would be feasible? And what we're seeing is, from a retail standpoint, it's really rehab, using those existing buildings a little bit more effectively. Maybe it's a coat of paint, improving the structure a bit. But it's the garden apartments and townhomes that are feasible right now for just the existing, kind of the existing market. But there are some that are borderline, which is the wrap and the podium, which are more the mixed-use types of development that we're seeing in the community as desirable. But then if you start looking at different ones, so what if you reduce parking requirements? Parking is expensive to develop and maintain. We talked a lot about parking through the code earlier. So what if you reduce those parking requirements 30%? And
is that 30% different than what we were talking about on the 25% reduction, or is that 30% in addition to the 25%?
No, this is reducing it generally from what you have now, down 30%, and that's not too dissimilar for what we're talking about. We're actually talking a slightly higher parking requirement, but 30% you're seeing in a lot of other suburban urban areas, and so it's taking that down, so you're not providing as much. But then also, tax abatements. Are there things or incentives that you could do to incentivize some of this development? And what you see with some of these programs or incentives is that a lot of things start to happen. Not only are the townhomes and garden apartments happening, but you start to see the wrap and the podium project actually start to pencil out. That's where you could get structured parking. Maybe that's a program or a partnership between the city and a developer. But creative office and office product is just not there. It's a tough product. There's not a lot of office being developed outside of central Portland. One in Hillsborough and one in Beaverton, I believe. Very few office products are being developed right now. But a lot of the other types of mixed-use buildings we've been talking about do become feasible. So it's not a big push to start to make these things happen, which is good to see. And then if you start to add a rent premium, this one where we didn't change the parking, it's just parking as it is now. If you can, manage to deal with the parking ratios and how to structure that. But if you get a 10 to 20% rent premium, which is a little bit ahead of where you're at now, but we're seeing growth in rents right now, even in Wilsonville since we started this project. As you add amenities to town center, rents can increase for residential. And so those types of things help the return on investment for developers. So again, you start to see even more green, but now you're starting to see creative office take hold. Some of that lower scale creative office, 1 to 2 story types of product. Mid-rise office, 5-story office buildings are still tough, but it's getting a little bit closer. So again, these are just different ways to look at scenarios for how things might change the field in terms of development. So favorable development conditions means that everything is on the table. You get the rent, you get the parking reduction, you get a rent premium, 20% increase, you get a tax exemption, and everything looks great. It would develop tomorrow. Mid-rise even starts to get there. All of these components are based on, though, that the landowner already owns the land. And so that it's, they can purchase it and it's vacant. So that doesn't take into account if you have to actually redevelop a property or you have to, purchase the property. So this is owned land, which is good. In terms of town center, there's a lot of large landowners. And so there's still something that's feasible here, even if you do own the land. So what we're seeing is that it doesn't take much to start pushing things over the top for town center, which is great. Because when I do these in a lot of other communities, it doesn't matter what you do, you're still below that return on investment. So there's a lot of opportunity here. So now things start to change with baseline 5 is that this is where a developer has to come in and purchase the property. either purchase it, redevelop it, which means that there could be an existing building on there that they need to do something with, and then that starts to change the equation quite a bit. Nothing really pencils out except for rehab, which essentially means you're just taking that same building and fixing it. But then if you start to add some of the incentives, whether it's parking reduction and tax abatement, Main Street apartments start to come back up, townhomes, garden apartments start to come up, but it's still a challenge for development to occur. And then if you add the rent premium, this is really the driver, even parking less so, but the driver is if you can increase the rents, about 20%, you do start to see some of those other mixed use and residential projects start to come up. I think that one of the big takeaways from this, and I'll show this last one, favor development conditions, everything's on the table. One of the key takeaways for this is that, what we've heard is that, people are scared of development. People are going to scrape town center and it's going to start fresh. What we're seeing from a feasibility analysis is that vacant parking lots are the things that are most tenable to be, developed now. There are a lot of parking lots in town center that could actually, change pretty readily, or vacant lots that could change readily. And really the redevelopment is a much longer term focus, because from the feasibility standpoint, you're just not getting the returns on investment if you have to displace other properties to do so. So that's a great opportunity here, because there's already a lot of space for infill that you could do right now, and that's pretty close from a market standpoint. So with that, from a challenge standpoint, how does this affect the vision that we've laid out for town center over time? Does this change how you see the town center vision? Is it disappointing? Is it exciting? What are your thoughts based on what you just saw?
Can I ask you a question first? One thing about all of the slides that are showing if the current landowner is doing the developing, and it's talking about a return on investment, but are we doing any sort of comparative analysis as how that return compares to the current return they're getting? In other words, they're only going to be interested in this new development to the extent that it's getting them a better return on investment than the current buildings and parking or everything else that they've got going on right now. Do we even know what that looks like?
That's something I'd have to ask Leland. What their analysis looks at primarily, and I think you're asking that assumption in between, that they own the land, but there's a building on there. Would they redevelop that based on that? Yeah. That's something that they would have to. It would require a bit more analysis to look at, and I think it would be, to be honest, a site-specific location, because like a big box retailer versus a small strip mall would have different questions and inputs about that. But I would say some of the larger developments or even vacant land here fits very easily within those first four options, where you have a lot of parking, for example, that's not used. That's essentially just unused, it's vacant space. Sure. And so there's a lot of infill that you could take care of before you even get into that question of, do I have to tear my building down or not to redevelop?
So yeah, the challenge is how would we have this great vision for Main Street? Given this feasibility, I can't see how that would come about. Maybe I'm not visionary enough for the planning, but the Main Street doesn't exist today. It's a section of a parking lot, and maybe the fact that it's kind of partly adjacent to a strip mall has potential for if that strip mall were to redevelop, you might be able to. What was the phrase? If you were to rehab that strip mall to be one side of the Main Street, I don't know if that would even fit. But that's the only real opportunity I have that I can think of right now to see how this Main Street concept will come around. Everything else is auxiliary, I think, that we've talked about, because the Main Street will be the pool and the heart of the town centre.
That's a great question, and one piece that we'll be addressing as a part of the implementation strategy are what is or are the catalyst projects that start to change that. Is the extension of Main Street from the park to Wilsonville Road, is that a key catalyst project that both the landowner and the city want to embark on, for example? With that type of investment, then that starts to open up opportunities for reconsidering how those adjacent properties develop over time. But that takes money on both public and private side to do that. I think some of the other pieces you could certainly see, infill even to the north, where there's vacant spaces right now that wouldn't take that investment. Those are areas that could happen today. But that's what's the catalyst? What's the framework project that kicks it off? I think that's the question that we'll be asking the task force in a couple weeks. But then coming back to you to confirm or talk more about is, what's that big project, and how is that funded, and is this going to get us where we want to go in the future?
What conversation is taking place among the landowners now?
I'm sorry,
what conversations are taking place among the large landowners now in the town center? Is that all just within the task force framework?
Do you want to take that one, Miranda?
There have been a number of meetings that we've had with the landowners and conversations by phone. We'll also have only a couple of them will be able to attend tomorrow, but have shown interest in finding out what comes of tomorrow's discussion with the panelists that we have coming in for the Economic Summit, which will talk a bit about the feasibility results and really what that means for the town center and things that other folks are doing, what incentives and strategies we have that might that we might be able to employ to really see this growth happen. So they continue, as throughout the project, to be engaged, but somewhat peripherally. And I think a lot of folks who probably work in this sector would agree that, they hold a lot of their cards close to their chest, a lot of their business decisions. So that's kind of, we stand similar to where we have before. They still answer our phone calls, so that's great. And the dialogue continues. So we hope that does continue even as this gets adopted and we start to then be able to look at some potential real projects. And once it's adopted, they may feel more interested or more secure in where the city lands in its vision and how to implement that.
Where the city lands, it is something of a leap to do this. Mm-hmm. It would be a risk, and it seems to me that the landowner on his own would be more reluctant to do it than if there were if they were taking it together. Mm-hmm. A group were taking it together, and it could be a group enterprise. I don't know how you facilitate that, but it seems to me that would be the ideal way to go, short of actual aggregation of the property.
Well, there's definitely interest in the increased opportunities. I mean, this plan provides additional opportunities that the existing town center plan and the existing code for town center does. And we've heard expressed interest in that and support for that from those property owners. So, but I don't think until, we often see this, until it's actually adopted and it becomes a real thing, there's not going to be a lot of business plans that are made or sort of detailed discussions had around that.
Very difficult to accomplish, but if we need a joint vision, a joint courage mm-hmm. to do this, to see it as a joint opportunity.
Yes.
One of the big things that struck me in this feasibility was the rent premium being mm-hmm. one of the real driving factors. Oh, thank you. And just wondering, you make a statement in here, may be achievable, might work. Yet what we've been talking about in a lot of our housing development around here is not increasing our multi-family units. So this kind of says, oh, we're going to build them and they're going to be even more expensive than, and one, I guess where that kind of, where did you come up with the assumption that this could work, that it, you know, at this premium cost for these downtown units? I mean, it's different if I'm living somewhere where part of the structure's already in place, but you're saying to make this feasible, you got to have these more expensive housing. So it's like cart before the horse a little bit. But just wanted to hear.
Sure. So the 20% rent premium, we're seeing that actually even when we started this process, some development, from what Leland has gathered, even within Wilsonville, rents have increased 10% in the past year and a half since we've started, looking at the financial pieces to this. But what we're seeing in places like Tigard and others is that they are actually seeing that 20% rent increase as a mixed-use product comes online. Downtown Tigard has a Atwater, I believe it's called, has a new product there. So you are actually seeing, not Portland, the suburbs are actually seeing increases in rent that are pretty close to what that 20% projection is for this area. You're absolutely right, though, that to achieve those rents, you need to be offering other services or amenities. And so likelihood early on here is that you could be developing townhomes, which are achievable now. If those are a nice product that starts to create that space, and then you start to get a little bit more services associated with that, then you can start to see other products come in. There's also, I think, opportunities for both the city and private developers to work together if you really do want a certain type of development to actually be able to foster that, whether it's through, vertical housing tax credit or other types of things that we'll be talking about in the implementation program that could start to bring some of those types of products there. The first couple buildings are always the hardest. And then as those come in, that's when you start to actually see that energy. I will say in terms of multifamily housing, though, that to achieve this vision, you need more people living in town center. I mean, I don't think there's any way to get around it. You need people on the streets. That's why you're seeing downtown Lake Oswego develop the way it is. That's why you're seeing Orenco Station develop the way it is. Even Gresham is transitioning in their downtown to have more urban types of living. So that's essential to be able to implement the vision, is to have more people living in town center. Does that answer your question? Thank you.
I would say I agree with Commissioner Springall that it seems like there definitely needs to be some sort of catalyst to drive this, and it feels like the Main Street District is that, and maybe it's a segment of the Main Street District, because I think one of the challenges that we have over Orenco is that this is a huge area. Sure. And to expect that we can just put this in and poof, things happen is going to be difficult. And, some of the areas that are really available are not maybe the areas that would be the catalyst developments. And so we need to be very thoughtful in how we stage this so that we set ourselves up for success and put the money where it could be used immediately to then help grow out as we go.
Well, in a couple of weeks, we'll be talking about that at the task force. That's incredibly important. It's like what goes first, and then how do you tie the money to it or the development to it? So that's to come in terms of how the plan and the implementation is organized. I do want to make sure we can transition to that just briefly because Scott needs to talk about traffic as well. But that's definitely to come, and we'll have a long conversation about that in the future. So if it's okay, can I just move it through implementation briefly? And I have a few slides. I'm not going to step through each one because I do want to save room for Scott. But we'll be coming back to these questions on implementation, particularly at our next meeting, so that we can actually start talking more in depth with this. But I wanted to give you a flavor of where we're going. All right. So from an implementation standpoint, we look at them, in a series of buckets. So there's the regulatory actions, the code, the TSP, all of those things you need to do to actually implement the plan. Then there's the infrastructure investments like the Main Street, extension, parks, sewer, water, all of those typical pieces. But then also tied with that are what are some of the placemaking strategies, parklets, parks programming, other types of things that we'd want to consider for town center, as well as some economic development and financing strategies. And so those are the key pieces that we think about when we start to put together an implementation program. And the key question for you, not tonight, but as we get into it is, what's the city's role in supporting this implementation strategy? Is it helping pay for a project? Is it, landowner support, or just making sure that the process gets through efficiently? There's a number of different things we'll be asking you in the coming months about that. But just some quick things that we've been, as we develop the laundry list, it's updating many of your plans. You've seen the code and comprehensive plan tonight, but there's others. The covenants, conditions, and restrictions are a big issue that we need to figure out how to address as a part of this, or at least have a recommendation for it. But then some of the other pieces that we were talking about, parking management strategy, we talked about that earlier. As the area develops, that's something you're going to want to consider. But then also a streetscape plan. We have cross sections, but what's the garbage can looks like? What's the exact street tree? Getting into some of those details to make sure you have a consistent palette of things. And then there's infrastructure projects, like larger framework projects, which is the pedestrian bridge, which is already on your radar in terms of work. But what does it look like in terms of connections to Main Street? Those Park Place projects. And then also quick wins. Are there different things you could do, like changing traffic control with paint and bollards? Could you put in buffered bike lanes pretty quickly? Those are the types of things that we're starting to talk about as we move into it. And, starting to lay out where some of these projects are. Again, how does this all come together? And then there's other projects, local roads that we talked about as development comes in, parks, sewer, stormwater. And so this is where we're going to start having that conversation with task force is, what's the city, where's the city stand? What's the private stand? How do we start to organize these projects to make them efficient and effective so we achieve the vision? And then also placemaking, are there cool things we could do? Branded bus stops, signage and wayfinding, which we know you're working on, that I need to give some space because I know they're talking after me. So, making sure we have those types of things. But also, are there different programs we can look at, like a Main Street program or a business improvement district? Those are all ways that you can pay for some of these types of things. And then also, different types of incentives. Vertical housing tax incentive has been very successful throughout the state program that the city can use for certain types of projects, as well as other grants. So I'm going to hold this question because I think we could spend a lot of time on this. And what I'd like to do is just say, that's where we're going with implementation, and we want to flesh that out a bit more, and we want to come back to you with some specific recommendations, but I just wanted to give you a flavor of some of the things that we're starting to think about. This is really the meat of the plan, and I want to be able to spend some time to talk about it, but again, I also want to respect people coming after us, so we give them time as well.
And I would just briefly make a plug for the event that we're having tomorrow, the Economic Summit panel discussion, which will take place at Regal Cinemas here in Town Center from 4 to 5:30. We have a panel of 5 people who are developers who have worked on private development. They've worked on development from the public sector. They've worked on incentives that range from financial incentives to also tenant improvement programs, assisting tenants into new spaces when you're in an area that's redeveloping and changing over time, how they've dealt with parking and how parking has shifted over time. So there's going to be a great set of folks that really range in their expertise sitting on a panel tomorrow that are going to talk about a lot of these implementation options, how they relate to the feasibility, how this kind of stuff can happen over time. And they'll actually talk about some of these economic development program ideas or strategies, both from how can the public invest in infrastructure and how does that impact development, but also what type of economic development strategies might we be interested in. And there'll be a really nice dialogue around it and an opportunity for people attending it to be able to weigh in on which strategies they think are most important for the city to be partnering with local businesses on. So I encourage all of you and anyone at home watching to attend that and help us with that conversation, because that will help feed into this prioritization with the task force that we're going to have, and then this discussion that we'll be having with you next month.
Do you plan on recording that event?
We had not planned on it, and as I was sitting here having this conversation, I was thinking about how that would be nice to have recorded. So I will see what we can do. It might be on an iPhone, but maybe we can get something.
I know you're wrapping up, but I really have one more thing in the code that I had to ask about, and we may have discussed it earlier, but I don't remember. In page 115 with the map of A2, it talks about the commercial mixed use and prohibited uses, or permitted uses, actually. So the thing that stuck out was that retail exceeding a footprint of 30,000 square feet would be permitted in the commercial mixed use. Other areas it needs to be under 30,000. So I went and investigated what 30,000 square feet really is. Right, that's Goodwill or Rite Aid. Safeway's a bit bigger, I think. But in the commercial mixed use, we're allowing something infinitely bigger. Fry's, I think, is 130 or something thousand square feet. Not very great utilization of space. So I wondered if we wanted to put a cap on that exceeding a 30,000 square feet, for the future.
Yeah, I think that's something we want to talk about. We had talked about restricting that, I believe, last time to 30,000 square feet. So that may be an error in the language.
I think it's restricted to 30,000 square feet in the town centre generally. But the way I read this is it's except in the commercial mixed use, the gloves come off as far as big box stores.
Well, and I think there might be an error in the text, so maybe we need to revise the text to make sure we're stating it correctly. Because I think what you're
I think generally, unless the commission feels otherwise, I don't think we need to allow much bigger stores than that.
Yeah.
Possibly in the commercial mixed use, there might be a justification for a little bit bigger, but we don't really want to have just big box stores.
Well, and that was something we were trying to get away from.
Right.
So,
well, but the caveat that I don't think I was trying to get away from that, I still tend to believe that an anchor tenant is a necessity. It's hard to do projects like these if you don't have some sort of anchor nearby.
That could be a good question for our development panel tomorrow too. Who've been working on that. What's the right scale for that? Yeah, you're right. 30,000 square feet. It's Rite Aid, Goodwill, Trader Joe's in Hollywood district is about 25 to 30,000 square feet. They're good sized buildings. What's the right size for this particular area that's a little bit more commercially focused?
And I think, which this language doesn't even state, that the conclusion from the discussion we had before, I believe, was in a standalone building. So an anchor tenant that's in a larger building it would not apply to that situation. So if it's in a mixed-use building, it would not apply. It's when it's a single-story standalone, it won't exceed that footprint on its own, was the discussion as I recall it.
It goes to this idea of driving between the stores, right?
Right.
Because you right now, if you go to Fry's, you drive to Fry's. Very rarely can you actually walk to Fry's, even if you're already in the town centre. And that's the concept that I think we want to get away from. We want to encourage walkability, and and reduce the amount of vehicles traveling from point to point within the town centre. So, if there's some larger building that has multiple larger retail facilities within it, but how big would that building be? I don't know. That's.
Okay. Well, let us do some work on that and get back to you. Thank you. Any other questions? I can turn it over to Scott. All right, well,
I think we can move on.
Yeah, well, thank you very much. There's definitely more to come on this. Appreciate it.
Evening, Chair and Planning Commission. Scott Manser with DKS Associates. And just have a couple of slides just to kind of summarize some of our traffic findings so far for the town center plan. First, I just want to talk a little bit about kind of the horizon year. We really focused on the 2035 scenario, similar to what was assumed in the city's adopted transportation system plan. We updated the volumes, we did new counts, and did updated forecasts from the City of Wilsonville travel demand model that looks at the future land use within the city and estimates future traffic. And the good news in that plan and what's been adopted to date is within the town center, within the land use, there is significant growth assumed for future development, which is already accounted for as you look at the financially constrained transportation improvements in the TSP. Those are all accounting for that future growth in the town center. And this is just a figure showing the existing transportation network. The blue circles are the study intersections where we collected traffic counts and did our analysis and modeling. And as you look at the next figure, this is really showing the changes in the transportation network. We did two sets of analysis as we looked at these study intersections and looked at the town center growth. We looked at the existing transportation network as approved in your transportation system plan, and we looked at this transportation modifications for assumptions within the town center, and I'll just kind of point those out here. We have the new Main Street, the Parkway extension that goes down to a new signalized intersection was our assumption. And then in connection into the site to the south. And as you think about the town center loop, really as this Main Street comes on board, it's really splitting some of the traffic volume from town center loop west and really splitting that volume. So you're going to see it's really going to look very different on town center loop west as the Main Street gets built and occupied to take some of that north-south traffic in and out of the town center. So we really envisioned, and I think next month we'll be coming back to you to kind of show you, what some of these intersections and what Wilsonville Road's going to look like with the town center developed. But the focus would be at the town center loop west. It's going to be a kind of a multimodal intersection, really intended for local access to businesses, but not the main artery that's really pumping traffic from Wilsonville Road, and more of a kind of a local circulation street. And then the Main Street, again, it's going to be a 3-lane. It's kind of really focused on one travel lane in each direction to provide access to these businesses, having access to and from Wilsonville Road to the Main Street. Rebecca, we're kind of looking at a change in that, removing that traffic signal, providing that to be more of a multimodal intersection with pedestrian and bike crossings and limited motor vehicle movements. And then Town Center Loop East being kind of a larger, more of a traffic volume, move the traffic in and out of Town Center to the land uses. So it's kind of the other extension. I talked about the Main Street, also the extension, of course, Side Drive to provide a better east-west connection. So there's, again, two traffic scenarios that we looked at. First was looking at the TSP horizon, looking at the growth that was already assumed and approved and the transportation network. And then we looked at this modified town center network with the Main Street and the extension of Courtside Drive. So this figure is showing, based on our 2035 TSP and using the updated counts and modeling, kind of how the system is going to operate in the future. Red is level service F, the little red circles. The kind of the tannish beige is level service D, green is level service C, and blue is level service B. And right now, for the interchange ramp intersections, those are based on ODOT jurisdiction. So that's actually a standard of a volume to capacity of 0.90. And if you think about capacity, think of each intersection is designed for a certain amount of capacity. If you think about a glass of water, once it's over at 1.0, that's when water will start pouring over. And again, right now the standard is about 0.9 for ODOT, so for those intersections. So for the next 20 years, as we go to 2035, those intersections were operating within the standard. And a lot of you that drive this interchange on a daily basis realize that there's a lot of congestion in there, and it really feels like it probably is a lot worse. And what we found in doing a lot of studies with Nancy and Steve and engineering, there's a lot of problems from I-5 that really back up. And as we look at this system, it's really looking at the capacity at that intersection and what it can serve. So one of the things is, as I go to the next figure, we have these two intersections because you have heavy volumes on Town Center. Those of you who go to Starbucks and some of those businesses, when you have your heavy volumes in the morning and the evening peak period, it can be challenging to turn off. And again, that's the minor street delay. That's how the level service F is having to try and make a left turn from those side streets onto Town Center Loop West. And as you look at the Main Street option, one of the good things about this new connections and the better connectivity, we make those better. And as I go to the next, any questions before I move to the next slide? So you can see the Town Center Loop West. One thing to note, this is the TSP financially constrained assumptions, and actually in the TSP it made it had a widening of Town Center Loop West to actually have individual dual right turn lanes. Today there's a left turn lane, a through right turn lane, and another dedicated right turn lane. And in the TSP it calls for a left turn lane, a through lane, and dual right turn lanes. And so those are assumed in that financially constrained list. Those dual right turn lanes are not needed under the Town Center option. With the new Main Street, we're able to take enough traffic volume that these intersections on Town Center Loop are more multimodal. The delays are much lower for motor vehicles, and we have the Main Street that's providing more, is basically splitting a lot of that volume that's right now on Town Center Loop West. It's some of that volume is moving to Main Street. And we're getting that traffic volume away from the interchange and moving it to the Main Street and Town Center Loop East away from the interchange. And so all the intersections, as we look at the growth assumptions for the Town Center and what was assumed in the model, everything meets your level service D standard and ODOT's volume to capacity. So for now, I think we'll have a lot more information for you at the next meeting, kind of go through more into those transportation improvements. That's kind of more of a high-level evaluation of the traffic analysis. And how this matters is as we deal with ODOT and transportation planning rule requirements, that we are able to follow the standards, and based on the assumptions that were made in the transportation system plan show that a lot of the development that is desired has already been included in the approved model and in the city's adopted transportation system plan. With that, I'll open it for any questions.
So going to the I-5 thing.
Yes.
Of I-5. So does this assume any I-5 improvements at the Boone Bridge, or?
It does not, because there's no funded improvements at this time. There's many agencies and ODOT are looking into improvements, but there's nothing on the books to date.
I thought when we had ODOT here that there was discussions about if nothing was done and we were looking at 20 years out, that there would be significant backlogs on Wilsonville Road, but this traffic analysis doesn't correlate with that.
Right. So the way that the standards are met and the standards are written, as I-5 is really ODOT's facility, and as we're looking at this, it's really what is the city's responsibility for these intersections and as development occurs. And so it's really an unknown of what's going to happen to I-5, but I would agree with that statement. Is if ODOT does nothing and traffic volumes continue to increase on I-5, you are going to have backups and continue to have congestion on Wilsonville Road during the peak periods.
So this is, okay, so in a nutshell, this is essentially ignoring that I-5 exists. It's just the capacity for the interchanges that are there.
Correct, the potential.
Yes, potential capacity, not real capacity based on actual traffic.
Yeah. Well, no, it's based on actual traffic, but in one of those things, it's not a everyday occurrence. So it's if you have a wreck, and those are things that are really hard to determine. But there is, as traffic volumes continue to increase on I-5, the merge and weaving is continuing to increase, which will add congestion.
Yeah. Yeah, I just want to make sure I understood what the basis was for this. Thank you.
I wanted to make sure that I provided the background, because otherwise I look like I'm a fool if I don't explain that to you, to say, oh, everything looks great. Especially in 15 years from now, you're going to have no problems. And Wilsonville's done their part to build capacity at that interchange.
Right. Miranda, are we done talking about Town Center Loop West alignment for this Town Center master plan?
No, we actually, this will be something that we'll be talking about at the upcoming task force meeting. You're talking about the original proposed alignment option that came out as part of the community discussion to potentially move it over to the east and potentially vacate a part of that on the west side. Yeah. There, as you remember, there were some mixed reviews related to comments we received back on the community design concept from the public, and it was one of the less favorable concepts on the table. It wasn't overwhelmingly a no, it was just kind of mixed. And one of the questions that really was raised was, is it really worth, do we really get that much bang for our buck in terms of that investment? And I think we're still having that conversation, and I know that there's still a few people on the task force who are interested in continuing that conversation because we didn't flesh it out completely at the last meeting. So it will be on the agenda for the next task force meeting to talk about what are the pros and cons of that. And there is a potential to include it as sort of an alternative, because the reality is that really vacating that portion of Town Center Loop West and just relying on an eastern alignment of it would be really the last improvement that it would have to come last. It's an improvement that couldn't come at the beginning because it relies upon the need for the Main Street extension, Courtside extension, having a lot of these other improvements in place to allow for, and then having that eastern alignment in place to be able to vacate the western alignment. And that's a lot of investments before that can happen. And so I think we'll have a conversation about task force, but it could be the potential that we leave both on the table, that once all of those investments are made, there could be a discussion around, do we vacate that and allow for additional development potential on the frontage of I-5? Is that segment of road necessary anymore? And make that determination once we actually have the investments, because we wouldn't be able to do it before then anyway. So, but that conversation is still alive. We will have it, and then we will bring it back to the Planning Commission.
Okay.
I would imagine that it would be amenable to a proposal by the developer of that property.
Well, what does the plan say? I mean, it will go down to what is the plan that this board and the city council approves of whether or not the developer can't just say, I'm going to move a road because I feel like it. We need to have that option in the plan. If that's what the task force.
Well, right now it goes straight through Fry parking lot. That is the projected route would go through the parking lot. If the parking lot ownership wanted to do it, I suspect it would change the equation quite a bit.
It could, yes.
If I could just add for a second too, with that connection on Town Center Loop West, what the traffic study is showing too is that connection is still important, whether it's inside the Fry's parking lot or on Town Center Loop West. So, as Miranda said, maybe that in the long term, maybe there's a reason to move it, but that connection is still essential to have the traffic function on Wilsonville Road. So we're distributing traffic by having that additional connection at Main Street, but if you take that connection out, that starts to alter the system a bit more. So it's kind of there's a lot of projects here. Do you want to spend money on that, or do you want to put a main street in or do a park project or something like that. We are talking about Town Center Loop West. Maybe you reduce the scale of it. Maybe it goes to 2 lanes. Maybe there's, you use some of it for stormwater or, linear park, some type of things like that. But that connection is still pretty essential to make sure that the system works. So that's why it's still there.
Yeah, I didn't think any of the assumption was to eliminate it, just alignment for best use of the frontage on I-5.
Yeah, and we should talk about that at task force. I think it's more of a where do you put your eggs in terms of money, and if that's what does that connection look like in the future. So certainly a conversation in the next couple weeks. Since I'm here. So in terms of next steps, we do have a task force meeting on the 23rd, so we'll be talking a lot about prioritization for some of these projects, getting into what comes first and how that starts to be structured in terms of implementation and those various elements. The key piece, though, is that we're actually getting into the draft plan now. So we're starting to write those specific elements that we'll be coming back to you here over the coming months to start to vet, those initial chapters, the overall land use concept, which we've talked a lot about, but these specific implementation strategies, making sure we have the code dialed in, making sure that some of those inconsistencies we've rectified before we, come to you again. But, getting that plan developed and the visuals there and getting the package ready to actually look through for, more formal review. And that'll be over the coming months, and I'm sure a few meetings with both you and City Council to help vet those questions. So, but we're getting into the fun stuff. This is really where it gets down to the nuts and bolts and making sure it all comes together.
Thank you.
We'll be talking again next month.
Next month, yes.
Thank you very much for your time tonight. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
We're only slightly behind schedule, but I propose that we take 5 minutes. So let's reconvene at 5 minutes before the hour. Got it.
You're good. You've got it under control.
All right, recess is over, and we're moving toward the consideration of citywide signage and wayfinding.
Thank you, Chair Greenfield, members of the commission. I'm Chris Namsu, the city's planning director, and with me tonight is Mary Stewart, landscape architect with Alta Planning and Design, and Mary and her design team are the primary authors of the draft citywide signage and wayfinding plan that you have before you today in printed form. We plan on walking you through the history of where we've been, showing you a number of design alternatives that have been considered, and then proposing a preferred design type, which you have a large 6.5-foot mock-up of one of the signs in the back of the room plotted on photo paper to really bring the signage package to life. And I'm really excited to be here. I've learned a tremendous amount through this process, which is always exciting for an old guy like me to learn a lot of new things. But we started this whole process out with what was called a visual identity exercise. We ended up working with a group of community members, and we went through this exercise in generating abstract design themes, and the themes that came out of that session were then taken back by the consultants, and three distinct sign families were created. And if you recall, the open house that we held, as well as the online open house, highlighted those three design types, and they were the ornate cast iron sign family, the undulating stone sign family, and the weathered wood sign family. We had over 200 people provide us with input in the online open house, and interestingly enough, the vast majority of those 200 participants were in the first couple of days of that survey being open. It was just like the first 2 days were just like 180 of the people came in the very first 2 days, which was interesting. And through that process, and from the consensus that was gained at the physical open house that was held here at City Hall, the undulating stone theme came out as the slight preferred style. And that's a core 10 metal. It's a rusted metal. It's a sign type that we have in a couple of other locations around the community. You'll find it across the street at Marassi Plaza. You'll find it down at the water treatment plant on Wilsonville Road. You'll also find it in Old Town and some of the private development areas there as well. And that was a 55% preference. So it wasn't a landslide by any means. And this is always one of the touchy areas where you go through these processes. You hope one comes out at like 95%, but it just never does. So the reality is that, almost half of the people chose other things, and 55 picked the one. We did go with the one because it was greater than a majority, and pursued a number of different alternatives to that sign based on the input there. That original design came with a Gabion wire basket, which is kind of an industrial application. You see it in wineries, you'll see it in fancy modern places, but it's literally a wire cage with real rock within it, and the sign was implanted inside of the Gabion basket. The Gabion basket was not as well received as the actual Core 10 rusted metal sign material itself. So we have spent a considerable amount of time looking at and testing a number of bases and different elements to the sign, and trying to find a design that represents the preference and taste of the community. And we're here today to show you that. The alternatives that we've gone through are many. I have an internal team of stakeholders where Mary's team would design the signs and come up with alternatives, and I would send those around, and I would solicit input and feedback from Public Works and from Parks and Recreation and from community development and administration, and I'd do informal surveys with my staff, and I'd show them pictures, and we'd talk about it. So a lot of the work has just been back and forth at the staff level with the design team, and Mary's firm has some wonderful graphic designers, professional graphic designers, and they do really cool high quality mock-ups that have allowed us to respond to a wide variety of materials. So we tested different bases, we tested different colors, we tested new sign toppers, and the preferred family that we brought to you today is basically slightly evolved from the original open house design, but it's still within the keeping of that. And I'm going to turn it over to Mary. Her presentation's about 15 minutes, and she's going to go through a lot of those alternatives. Tonight is your opportunity to provide us with feedback, not only on the preferred sign family, but also on the distribution of the signs, the phasing of the signs, the implementation chapter, phasing chapter, and sign location. We seek input on any and all at this point. My next steps will be a work session with the City Council on November 5th. So we're likely not going to make changes between now and then. We'll probably take the same package to them, collect your input, collect their input, make one more round of kind of collective changes, come back to you. If we need another work session, we can do that. If not, we'll probably head towards some sort of adoption if we can find some sort of recommendation, if we can find consensus around the program that you have before you today. So I've said way too much, okay?
You covered half my presentation.
Sorry, Mary.
All right, is this on? All right.
Yes.
Get a little closer. Thank you for engaging in this process. It's been a really fun one. We've had a great chance to get to know community members and stakeholders. Our focus group was a great group of people. I think, and I'm blanking on names, somebody out here was on our focus group.
Mr. Millen was there?
Yeah. And it was a fun process, and it was, I think, a really interesting one because we did not anticipate, and we never do. We never have our fingers so on the pulse of a community that we understand exactly where a design is headed. But some of the things that came out of this one really kind of surprised me, but I really think that it's coming up with a really positive, really great design. With our focus group, one of the things we did beyond the visioning, the visual identity exercise was we asked them for feedback on the project goals and took their feedback and developed, this is our guiding principles. So as we were going through this process, we kind of kept coming back to these and thinking about what was important, especially when it came to prioritizing routes and locating signs, and you'll see that further along in the presentation. And I'm not going to read all of these, by the way. As Chris said, we went through the visual identity exercise. We brought it to an open house and an online open house. Tonight, we're now here with you folks at the Planning Commission level. We'll take your feedback and present that with this information to City Council and make a final set of refinements before we jump into the design intent drawings, which are the ones that we hand off to the sign fabricators so that they can begin their work. We do have a demonstration project as part of this project with a budget associated with it to take some of those signs and actually get them built as part of this process. We're a couple months behind schedule because of some of the refinements we've been going back and forth on, but we think we're still thinking about starting in the spring, but we'll see where we end after City Council. As Chris mentioned, we met with a focus group of stakeholders. We came back to the open house, presented the 3 concepts, took it to the online survey. The options that we presented, we looked really locally for signs, for elements, themes, for inspiration. We took the feedback from the focus group along with some of this imagery that we collected in the process of doing our research and came up with the concepts. They were really developed based on those general themes that we heard. We heard some really strong sentiment about a love of the nature of the river. A lot of the river rock that came through and some of the examples really came out of that. The flowing forms, things like that, were really linked to Wilsonville's connection to the Willamette River. We also heard pretty strongly that there was an interest in some ability to hold on to the historic character in Wilsonville that seems to be kind of evaporating or has evaporated over time. So the first option we developed was this ornate cast iron option that was meant to really kind of feel like a historic tie into an old downtown. And we heard some feedback that it was kind of old, stuffy. I think the worst feedback was that it looked like a gravestone. But people love the color. The undulating stone option in the open house seemed to be far and away the favorite, but was just, as Chris mentioned, 55% of the overall vote from everybody. But the comments we received on this one were that people really liked the fluidity and the shape. They really liked the sense of connection to nature. The third option was weathered wood, and honestly, very few people liked this option. We were really trying to echo the old barn and kind of tie into the agricultural heritage in the valley, but we just couldn't get this one to get traction. And you'll see a little tiny icon for a chair up there that was actually tied to the visual identity exercise, which is kind of a fun thing, but it helps take a design theme and makes it more abstract so people can give you more honest feedback than they would if you were just asking them what kind of sign they wanted. And as Chris mentioned, the preferred option was the undulating stone. We took this survey from people and had them comment about what they really liked and what they didn't like about the options as well, so that when we came back to do refinements, we knew what to focus on. And people liked a lot of things. For the undulating stone, they really liked the materials, they really liked the shape. Some people really liked the color, but when we asked them also what they wanted to see changed, color also rose to the top. I think that's just one of those things we're not going to be able to please everybody. But the overall love of the core 10, I think, really stood out, and a love of stone. We took this feedback and we looked at some options to test, and we worked with the city and tested a lot of things. I'm going to show you a few of those really quickly. We were asked to test different options for the base. Like Chris mentioned, nobody really loved the architectural Gabion idea, so we tested using core 10 for the base. Somebody also mentioned really liking the Wilsonville taupe, so we tried testing with that color. Another person mentioned that they really liked the Wilsonville gray, and these are actually straight out of the branding guidelines that the city has developed. So we tested one option with that, with a formed concrete. We tested, this is the Wilsonville navy, although it looks almost black on the screen up there. And we tested that with kind of a stacked stone or stacked block kind of base. We tested a dark brown. Somebody had mentioned really wanting a dark brown. We tested that with just a quick sample of what maybe a grouted river rock might look like. We got some feedback back from the city. It was none of those bases really sing for us. Can you refine them a little bit more and bring them back? And that's what we have up here. So we're testing more refined bases with a little bit more realistic looking. We also added the ledge stone based on some feedback we received from the city. And we were still really trying to see if we could come up with something that could answer that color question. So we came up with some more lively, energetic colors to see if that maybe appealed to folks. And what we heard was no. That was a little too modern. What we heard was we really like traditional. Some of the other things we tested were some more traditional arches and a little bit more traditional detailing, and we did these intentionally in gray tones so that people wouldn't focus on color and would just focus on shape. In this example, we also tested different fonts. We added a little welcome to which you don't see very well at this detail, but you can see it pretty well at the example in the back. We tested some different topper options, et cetera. What we kind of heard was, that's actually a little too traditional. We really liked the original shape, the fluidity of the original shape better. So this is a refined, updated, preferred undulating stone option with updated fonts, updated with the welcome to. As you can see, we still have a couple little options here. We have 2 options for a sign topper. So if you have feedback on that, we'd love to hear that. We also have a couple options for the large park or large city building sign, one with all of the text on one row that's a little bit longer, and one with a more condensed shape sign with text on 2 rows. We also tested the Wilsonville logo on the sign itself and on the face of the ledge stone. And we tested 2 different types of vehicular signs. So these are going to be fairly tall. You can see that the bottom of those signs are 7 feet above ground, above finished grade. We have one with a simple arch and one with an arch with a return curve. And so we're hoping to get feedback on that from folks tonight and at City Council. And anybody who is in the room is fair game to weigh in. The other thing I wanted to talk about really briefly was some of the prioritization we did, both for destinations and for routes. And this helped us determine where our signs are located. So super quickly, just to make sure we're all on the same page, for wayfinding principles, we have 4 main principles. We need them to connect us, right? So if you have a route that jogs, like often if you're biking or walking, we need it to connect us to tell us when to turn. We need to be able to maintain motion. We need to know how far away it is. We need to be able to glance up, see a sign, understand where we're going, and not spend too much time staring at the sign. We need it to be located in a predictable place. Before we need to make a turn, after we make a turn, confirming we're still on the same route, and we need to keep the information as simple as possible. So one of the next couple slides I'm going to show you is going to be breaking down the destinations into level 1, level 2, and level 3. These are really specific. Level 1 is that destination at the top of the sign. When you glance at it, it tells you you're headed the right direction. So if you're on the freeway and you're in Eugene and you know you're supposed to be going north, and at the top of the sign it says Ashland, you know you got on the wrong way. That's what that level 1 space is for. Level 2, that tells you general landmarks. Level 3, that's your close destination. That's where you're headed usually. This just gives you a quick example of what that means in miles and how we translated that into wayfinding destinations for Wilsonville. The top level are our local kind of big destinations. So if you're headed north, you know you're headed towards Argyle Square from here. If you are headed west, you're headed to Old Town. If you are headed north, you're also headed to Clackamas Community College, or Oregon Institute of Technology, I mean. But these are the destinations that were originally developed as part of the previous wayfinding exercise. It was for pedestrians and cyclists. We took this information, took it to the focus group and the city, developed a more refined destination list and a more refined ranking. We came up with the abbreviations, and the important thing to note there is that's what it's going to look like on a sign. So if you don't like something in the abbreviation list, we need to hear that. We have about 14 or 15 spaces typically on a sign for text and blank spaces. So every space counts. That's why you end up with something that says Town CTR Park as opposed to Town Center Park. it can feel awkward, but we really need to keep those brief, and if there's a better way to abbreviate them, we want to hear that. Another thing to note up here is we came up with a name for all of the different tech industries that are kind of grouped together. We're calling that Tech Corners. So if anybody has feedback on that, if you don't want to hear it called Tech Corners, let us know.
Can you take a quick rewind? What's the Tech Corners? Because I was looking at that and trying to figure out what that was.
So that is where we have...
It's where I work? Okay.
Yeah.
Good enough for me.
I was about to ask the same question.
No, I know where it is.
It was a hard one because you can start naming businesses, right? And I've never really had a name for the area where all those tech businesses are located, right in the heart. You know, OIT's right there too. So Mary came up with this idea, and we thought it was worth pursuing and having a conversation about.
But you can always veto it. But
Yeah, everyone will be scratching their head on that one. But it's true, we don't really have a name. People call it Mental Graphics or Xerox, and of course Xerox is becoming increasingly less accurate, and so is Mental Graphics for that matter, because it will be Siemens soon. So
yeah.
I don't know. Yeah, you're right. You can't use business names because they're going to change. And
on the other hand, corner seems kind of local, really narrow.
yeah, it's just tech businesses, tech industry,
Tech in Wilsonville is growing, and it's going to outgrow a corner.
Yeah.
Right, yeah, and DW Fritz moving from their previous location in Tech Corners to the other side of the freeway.
Hillsborough has Silicon Forest. So you know what does Wilsonville have, right? Silicon
Field
traffic. No. Silicon Field. I like that one. Yeah.
Or Silicon Acres.
So these are orchards.
Yeah.
Yeah.
We can circle back to that at the end if you want to think on
We
it.
have to circle back, but water treatment park has to change.
Perhaps
Yep.
this is in the nature of an emergent reality.
Yeah. But again, we'd love feedback on things that you want to see changed.
I'll tell you right now the things that don't make sense. The water treatment, just water treatment park or water treatment plant. Park, probably. But you don't need to say plant and park. Then right down the bottom, the schools are misnamed, I guess. You know, it's not Inza School, it's Wood School. And then Meridian will probably be Meridian Creek rather than Meridian School.
Well, and I would say the discrepancy in the naming type, where you've got Wilsonville High, and then you say Inza School, and then you have Lowry Primary, where...
Yeah.
I mean, do you want to differentiate between high, middle, and primary for all of the school names?
Was your focus group, did you say it was pedestrians and bicyclists?
No, our focus group was all different kinds of members of the community. The wayfinding destinations list was derived based on previous wayfinding work that was focused.
And that's what I was asking.
Yeah.
And the reason why I brought that up is when I drive into a city that I don't know, I look for those destination level 1 signs. Mm-hmm. And knowing Wilsonville, town center is going to be a misnomer for me, because I'll go there expecting the post office and the city hall and not find it necessarily. And I see that post office and city hall and library are way down at level 3. So for my wayfinding, I would want City Hall to be something that is more at level 1. Because if I'm coming into town, that would be a place to me to orient myself as a civic center. Especially if I have an emergency.
I want to go back to your sign toppers. Oops, is that on? Yeah. The sign toppers. Although I like the city logo.
Thank you. I keep figuring, can't turn that on.
Take corners.
Obviously, that's not where I work. Although I like the city logo, it looks kind of weird sitting up on top of that sign. I'm sorry, the scale is all wrong. So I don't know. When you have it down here on the gateway sign, I like it incorporated into there. But on top of that sign topper, it just kind of,
Okay.
yeah, the scale's just really awkward.
Way to the right, the one on the right side, you mean?
Yeah, the one way on the right, on the sign toppers, and then
It says cap topper, I think.
Yeah.
It's like a cap, it's hard to tell, but it's envisioned to be more of like a cap
Yeah.
on top. So graphically, that may make no difference to your preference for it, but I had to ask about that one too.
yeah, okay.
Yeah, that one came out of a comment that somebody wanted to see something different. I think somebody felt like the topper on the left was too large. It actually has been scaled down a little bit. It was a little bit taller, so it was kind of dwarfing the sign name.
Well, you could, the topper on the left, you could shrink it vertically by just striking Oregon. You don't need to write Oregon. Most people would know.
Yeah.
Hopefully,
That we're in Oregon.
Hopefully.
I mean, unless they've just come down from the coupe and they didn't realize.
There was a fair amount of debate over whether or not to use Oregon in that particular space. And it was determined that because of the Wilsonville, Oregon, because of the way the logo is designed, because the logo is the logo and then it's Wilsonville, Oregon, that we should mimic that. But that was just, that's part of the discussion. It's not law or anything.
I wouldn't personally. I was going to bring that up as well. I personally thought it was kind of odd that we had to put our state on our signs.
So if you don't know you're in Oregon, you're way lost. Wayfinding isn't
those
going to help
signs aren't going to help you.
There is a Wilsonville in Oklahoma or somewhere. Literally,
Alabama.
There's two in the United States. So not that we need to put it on our signs to separate ourselves from that other location. My business card, the logos for the city before the rebranding, always had said City of Wilsonville in Oregon. It was kind of on everything. So it's a legacy of the past that we're happy to let go of. And this is excellent type of feedback. I know
Yeah.
Mary didn't get to the end of her presentation, but
I can.
this is what we're looking for. And I think even if we were able, Chair Greenfield, to let each member of the commission just speak about their feelings about it, and that might be a good way to really get everybody to have a chance to speak.
Do you want these organized by specific items?
We can do it however it works probably most efficiently.
Free-ranging reaction.
We do have some prioritization maps to show too.
Sure. Why don't you finish?
Good idea.
Okay.
Please.
And that'll give you some time to really think about what you want to hit me with. All right, so we covered our destinations. We took that information along with what we understood and just did some data crunching. We have some algorithms we run where we take priority destinations, what we call attractors. We take population, traffic patterns, and we start to lay out where we think data is telling us at least where the priority routes are. And we did this because the signage program is for people walking, biking, and driving, with the assumption being that it's for people walking and biking locally and people who are visiting as drivers. and we developed a map for each mode of transportation. When we combine those and start kind of filtering through that information, we came up with the map on the right, or sorry, on the left up top. And it prioritizes some very key routes, and then we use those routes to determine the first attack at laying out priority wayfinding sign locations. This is all being produced in the report that I believe Chris has shared, and just to make it big so you can see it all, Phase 1 priority routes are Wilsonville Road, Boons Ferry Road, Parkway Ave from Ellickson Road to Town Center Loop. Phase 2 is Beckman Road, Town Center Loop, Barber Street, and the built parts of Kinsman. Phase 3 is Grams Ferry Road, Brown Road, 95th Ave, Canyon Creek Road, and Ellickson Road, the remainder of Ellickson Road. And what this doesn't address is roads that are new, that are in the process of being designed or built now. It also doesn't address park signs or building signs, with the assumption that new parks would automatically get a new sign, and parks or buildings with older or aging signs would get those updated based on the maintenance needs of existing signs. And we understand that there are quite a few park signs that are in need of upgrading or significant maintenance. So,
how have you identified these routes? Has Wilsonville ever used Bluetooth tracking?
There are definitely apps out there, whether it's like Google or Waze, that can document where traffic's really heavy. It doesn't necessarily document where people are trying to get to and from, but we took that data crunching that we did and we vetted it with Chris and the stakeholders that he mentioned that he's working with at the city, the various departments, to get feedback on it. And we definitely got some feedback that was like, oh yeah, Villebois is a much bigger destination than people think. According to population and according to what's out there, it doesn't read as a significant destination yet, but we heard very much to the contrary that it was. So things like that kind of needed to be ground truthed in a way that kind of only humans understand, and that pure data doesn't really tell us yet. But no, we did not use Bluetooth to determine routes.
I recall that Portland State actually has a database that makes use of Bluetooth tracking. When you enter the city, it picks you up and it follows you around. That can be collected and analyzed at Portland State. Are you familiar with that?
Not for vehicles. I was aware of some of the stuff they were doing to track bicyclists. The thing with motorists driving around is sometimes they're driving around because that's what Google's telling them to do, and they miss their stop and they keep going around and keep going around and keep going around. So there's a certain amount of information that could be useful, and some information might kind of actually just, it might be more like our data, based on the analysis that we did, wasn't 100% accurate to begin with. It's kind of a starting point so that we're not just throwing a dart at a dartboard. It helps us really kind of hone in on what should be a priority, and then we have people who are really here and on the ground and can go, oh no, we hear people get lost and they don't find this location all the time. And then, you know, we layer in what we know about the traffic and what we know about where things get congested and where people get stuck in traffic and don't know how to get out once they get off the freeway. So that's probably why Wilsonville really rose to the top.
I can't tell you the number of times somebody's told me they've been lost in Villebois, or either going to or trying to get out of Villebois sometimes. So, but I don't see that on the residential. I mean, it's a big residential area, and sometimes you need to know your way out of there, whether, you know, but I don't see that on here unless it's Barber Street.
Partially because they have their own wayfinding.
Oh, they do.
Yeah.
It doesn't seem to work very well.
It doesn't, and without doing an analysis of their existing wayfinding signage, which we did not do as part of this project, but we were essentially told if you can get people to and through Villebois, that'll help solve the problems, and Barbara was identified as a primary route for that. For the other roads, they're already signed for Villebois.
Okay.
They need lighted exit signs, I think.
It's the roundabouts, so
You know,
Way out.
the old song about the MTA lost
forever, yeah.
under Boston.
So on the previous slide, I just want to make sure that I understand, and this may be directed more towards Chris than to you, Mary. So looking at the area where Frog Pond is going to be, I see that there is a welcome sign at our existing edge of the neighborhood. Is that really going to be up north to where Frog Pond North would be?
Yeah. If you recall, even in the Frog Pond West plan, there was a couple of pages on signage and gateways and some of the treatments, including the Beckman Dip Bridge had some markers, the corner, and then it'd be up at the edge of the UGB. So we can add one. I mean, the one at the corner where it is today has been shown, so that one probably does need to be moved to the north to represent the future northern boundary of the west neighborhood. So that's a great observation.
Do we know what the timeline is for the implementation, for the construction of that?
So there's some projects that are actually coming into the city that are going to move about halfway up along Stafford Road. So these are applications that are coming in within the next couple of weeks.
Oh, wow.
So we've got the first applications in that neighborhood, but we're actually all the way with this West Hills application. It'll be essentially all the way up to Frog Pond Lane with annexation. So that'll be the new northern boundary. Stafford having a high volume of traffic, it was envisioned that there'd be a new defined edge to that northern, that west neighborhood would be the new edge coming into Wilsonville. So we can.
But you do have a welcome sign there now, so something needs to happen there, or
would you say?
I don't know what. It's you kind of got a lot of space right there
on that corner.
Yeah,
where
that corner's got like a big old, you know, indentation there and a couple of yards right there, and there's a pretty big sign there.
Yeah. And to think if you're coming from the east, it's now out at the edge of Meridian Creek School, right? And that seems like kind of a little bit of an odd place for because it seems so far out, right? But
well, we also talked during the whole Frog Pond project, right, of having those gateways into the community portion too. So I wonder then if we're going to have Frog Pond signage over there, if it actually ends up being, but I guess by the time we're flanking both sides of Stafford Road there, we probably do want a City of Wilsonville welcome sign there, but when? I don't know.
Right.
Yeah, and maybe I guess it's a long term for the Frog Pond east side to at least indicate that, hey, we do plan eventually to have those signs out to the east and then up to the north as well.
Just acknowledging the fact that you got a sign there, and it's a little bit awkward because you've got a lot of space that you probably already have the right of way for.
Right.
Yeah.
So
absolutely.
I don't know what to do with that.
Coffee shop.
Give those people some more yard.
There you go.
Coffee shop, yeah. Affordable housing.
Miniature park.
So we would love to get feedback on all of this. If there's a sign, and we tried to indicate which way a sign was pointing. So some of the ones that where directionality is really important, we've got like a little arrow. They need to be a lot bigger, yeah. We've heard, Chris gave us a good.
It's not any bigger on here either, so it's kind
of. But the feedback is great. We'd love to hear if there's something missing, if there's something that should be moved over. I mean, we're definitely not. I'm not a Wilsonville resident, so I'm not as much of an expert as you all are. So hearing from your kind of firsthand experience of how people would use these signs, how they drive through these corridors would be really helpful.
Let's be helpful.
Yeah.
Commissioner Hurley, do you have any observations to offer?
Not on the locations, because I was thinking more about what we had in here. So.
Oh, I think it's open season.
Open season, yeah. Any comment on anything and everything? That's the end of my presentation. So.
Okay, I thought you wanted specific locations. I wasn't mentally. That's not where I was. So back to wayfinding destinations. The Westland Wilsonville School District, at least from what I've seen, especially because so many of the school names are quite long, they just go with the abbreviations for primary school, middle school, and high school. So PS, okay. MS, and HS. I think that, and then like it was brought up that.
Use your microphone, Peter.
Techie.
It's a section.
So Meridian Creek and it is Meridian Creek. It's not just Meridian.
Okay.
And then Wood is Wood Middle and Boons Ferry. And Beckman Creek. And then on your preferred alternatives, I don't remember exactly what you referred to it as, and when you had your soft flowing connected undulating stone, this, let's see, it's page 20 of 31, where you have a little bit of a return on the top of the sign.
Yes. You like the return?
Yes.
Awesome.
It's my vote. And then on the prior page, 19 of 31, where you have, as your example, Boons Ferry Park, where it is the bottom left, where it's Boons Ferry at top and then Park at the bottom.
All right.
I think it's easier for the eye to block it when you're quickly looking for something. That's it from me.
Is the base okay? I mean, I'd like the base too, because that's different from, so if we could, sorry.
Yeah, that's what, that was going to be what did we end up doing with is this picture right here show the base?
It's a ledge stone veneer.
And for me, ledge stone veneer,
yeah.
That's my vote.
Good, great, thank you.
So that
is the preferred.
Okay.
So it's kind of like the Marase sign, but that's a bigger veneer. This is a smaller stacked rock. So the look is different than Marase, but the colors are somewhat similar. This has some rounds and then some skinny, flatter style ledge stone. So it is a kind of a material you do find around the community. It's out there today, so it was a logical connection.
Yeah, one of the pieces of feedback we got, when we went through the visual identity exercise, we talked a lot about materials, and I brought up the question about brick, because there is brick everywhere in Wilsonville, and what we heard loud and clear was don't come back with signs that have brick in them, come back with signs that would complement a brick building behind it. So something that would coordinate well with that. So that was our objective.
Commissioner Mellon, do you have any more?
Well, I love it because it's kind of was one of my first preferences. So, I mean, it's a win for me.
She voted 20 times.
Yeah, I did. No, and I think you've already heard. I agree that the Boons Ferry and then Park underneath, because that catches your eye, and I like that. I do, on the Welcome to Wilsonville, I think we do need the logo. I don't like it down on the stone. I like it up on the base of the thing. And then I think on the, I guess there are the vehicular signs. I don't know. not really moved one way or the other on that. It's kind of like, I like the curve, I think, better.
Okay.
I think one of the things back on the wayfinding destinations, I'm kind of kicking it around, and I don't know whether the smart station or where the bus stop and the train, and if that, I know it doesn't fit in this 1, 2, 3 kind of level, but it feels like it's more important. If you're coming into town and you're kind of wondering where the bus originates, or where the train originates or something, I'm just kind of playing with that a little bit. I mean,
So you're saying you'd like to see it as a destination level 1?
Or at least a 2.
Okay.
Well, again, if you're coming into town to pick somebody up who's there, you want to be able to know where it is.
Yeah, that's what I'm thinking, or, down the line when we have the people coming across the bridge on the bikes, and then they're going to go catch the train back into the city or something. I don't know. I'm just kind of looking at the future a little bit.
It'd be good to get more people out of their cars, too.
Yeah. They take the, okay, that's all I have. Thank you.
Thank you.
All right, let's do it. Okay, so we've talked about, page 18.
And if anybody wants to pile on to previous comments, Peter or Phyllis, let me know. I'm doing a little tally over here. So if anybody starts debating on the other side and disagreeing, we'll have like a count.
Do you want to go to page 18?
Actually, what are we describing?
This 18 of 44?
Yeah, 18 to 31. The preferred option, undulating stone.
All right.
There we go. Yeah, okay. Strike out Oregon. I'll be happy. I agree that the small Wilsonville logo on the far right for the alternate topper is not ideal. If the size of the sign topper is a concern, then you could narrow the width of the other sign topper and solve that. Everything else I like. Next page. I prefer as well the Boons Ferry and then the park on the next line. I like the logo placement on the sign itself. I think it would also be more affordable to build a sign with it on there instead of having it on the stone, because then you got to put some other metal piece on the stone. Next page, I like the curve. So I agree with Commissioner Hurley there. Okay, down to the wayfinding destinations. Yeah, I'm not sure if Tech Corners is a level 1 destination, even though I work there and I think it's a great place. Yeah, I would almost think that the Smart Station would be a higher priority than the Tech Corners. Maybe there's a way to combine Oregon Tech with some other verbiage to kind of group that area. Yeah, especially with them being right next to each other. It seems kind of weird to have Tech Corners and Oregon Tech right there.
Is there a suggestion for a different name?
All right. I struggle because we're not calling out any other major business areas. And so it seems a little weird.
Argyle Square.
Argyle Square, yeah.
To retail. Yeah, okay, so, but that's retail, not business. Yeah.
But we'll probably end up calling out Basalt Creek.
Tech employment.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. But that's a district, that's a whole.
Yeah, this got built before we had districts. I came up with Tech Glen and Tech Grove. I'm just throwing them out there.
Yeah, I guess my concern is if the sign brings up more questions than it answers, then it's a bad sign. And so I can't right now come up with a way to make it make sense. And so if I can't make it make sense, I'd say get rid of it.
Okay.
And we got something better to put on a sign.
The one thing we really try to do is not give a specific business a call out on a public wayfinding sign. It's something that I think once you do it with one business, then other businesses want their businesses shown, and it becomes more advertising and less wayfinding, and it adds to sign clutter.
Yep.
So that's part of the reason why we're trying to stay as generic as possible, but still identify where we thought people would be traveling, especially visitors coming for meetings. Yeah.
I use my phone.
What do you do when your battery dies?
It doesn't. That's why I have a charger.
Never.
Business center doesn't work for you guys?
What do you do when you accidentally block your own phone instead of blocking your son's phone? True story.
Okay, fair point. We need a sign.
I just think we don't ever, that's the first time I've ever heard it called that. So I think that's what we're all reacting to. It's like, what? Where is that? I mean, it's not common slang that we use.
My reservation about it is that it is too local, and it does not give fair acknowledgement of Wilsonville's tech industry, which is not located there.
Gotcha.
Yep.
Okay.
Yeah.
Move the other end.
Wait, one more. I promise, that's it. Wayfinding routes. I thought it was odd on the map that I can kind of read that the intersection of Beckman and Wilsonville, that's Beckman Canyon Creek is the only area that has all 4 directional signs for vehicular traffic. It's the one spot in all of Wilsonville per this map that has all 4 directions. I don't know if that was intentional, and I don't know if it's necessary, just something to think about. That no other area has all 4 directions, and there's not many areas that have 2 directions.
What we heard was that when I-5 gets backed up, that becomes a primary auxiliary route to get around the backup. And that Beckman Road became really important at that point too. But if that's not...
That would be for people that are trying to transit through Wilsonville and not in Wilsonville. Yeah. Let them get lost.
All right.
As a resident,
You also wanted the welcome to go away too, didn't you?
I just wanted to be north.
as a resident on Canyon Creek, I'm not crazy about that idea either.
But it's a very walked intersection though too.
Yes. Oh yes.
It's a very walked intersection.
I've also I've done the bike ped count on that corner.
Yeah.
And it certainly is, and bikes too.
Yeah.
All right, I'll start the other end. Commissioner Mesbah.
Oh. I agree with whatever has been going on. The only one that I disagree with is page 19 of 31. English is left to right, and to me, blocking it is the equivalent of having to scroll down to get to information. Have it on one line. That's the natural kind of flow of English print to me. That's my only comment, but I'm outvoted by my friends on the other side.
For now, we haven't got all of those.
But you agreed with the vehicular sign with the return curve,
Yes.
with ledge stone, logo on the sign, not the stone. Okay.
That it?
Yes.
I am, let it be on the record that I agree completely with Commissioner Hurley on this one matter.
What's the date?
So,
You're my attorney.
the Boons Ferry Park sign, since we're on this slide, I also agree with Commissioner Hurley. I think it reads better this way, more compact, despite not being on one line. I also agree that the logo though belongs on the sign, not on the stone. Can we go to tech corners?
Starting to stick. Be careful.
So business employment, business tech employment, tech businesses. I don't know, the Xerox Park got converted, or supposedly converted, into a park for multiple businesses, maybe. What's the branding for that?
Parkway Woods. They have their own signage for it too.
So they have their own signage. Yes. We don't necessarily, maybe that Parkway Woods, could that be a destination that we appropriate to put on this, on the city wayfinding sign? I don't know.
Technically, that is the Xerox campus. Yeah. Technically, that is Xerox campus. We have, upwards of 4,000 to 5,000 employees outside of that boundary that are kind of right in that same area. But I think it's going to take a little more thinking on this one.
Yeah.
I struggled with what do we call the 95th Avenue corridor, where we've got thousands of jobs.
And there's a lot of tech jobs there too.
Right, and we failed to really come up with anything catchy for 95th Avenue other than 95th Avenue employment area or something that just was obvious like that.
Yeah. Okay, so we don't really have good names for these business districts, and we're going to add more.
Yeah.
And they all need good names. Maybe we need to think about the branding of these different business districts.
You can do a citywide survey and ask people to name it.
Right. Yeah. That's what you get.
Prizes.
Yeah.
The Piazza is the Piazza. It's not the park. Wilwa Piazza. Com Center, I always wonder when I see that abbreviation COM what it stands for. So, I think it needs to be Community Center or Community C or something. And then the smart station earlier was referred to as the Wes Station. Sometimes it's frequently called the Wes Station. Sometimes it's called the Smart Station. Sometimes it's called Wilsonville Station. I like Wilsonville Station, but it's not widely adopted. But it serves Wes and it serves Smart and it serves supposedly our transit centre. There's not many West trains, but let's not go into that right now. So I prefer Wilsonville Station. Smart Station doesn't sound right. And I agree with the schools, HS, MS, and PS.
Is that it? Mm-hmm. Yeah, as long as we're talking about schools, yes, I agree with what Commissioner Springle had to say, but yes, please, INZA needs to change to Wood because nobody knows it as anything other than Wood Middle School, so that has to change. I agree with the whole Tech Corners discussion we're having. I do agree that Smart Station, whatever we call it, I guess I'm kind of partial to Smart, but I do believe that should be a number one, especially if we want it to be more frequently used. On all the signage stuff, I agree with what everybody else had to say, except for I think Commissioner Mesma is really losing out on this vote because I'm with the stacked lettering as well on that one. I worried on the sign topper thing, I think somebody else had said it too. The one is too small, but the other one is too large. I like the curved one up top, but that needs to shrink down. It was too dominating over the other portion of the sign. Trying to think of anything else. Oh, can we go to the map? Because everything else, I'm pretty much agreeing with what everybody else has to say. As I said before, I mean, that corner on Beckman and Canyon Creek is a very walked and very biked little corner, and I actually don't have a problem with there being 4 signs there. But, living in Wilsonville Meadows, which for your orientation is right there by the high school and by Beckman School, that's a very biked area as well, and it seems a little odd to me to not see on either of those 2 intersections, either by the one that goes in by Beckman or the other one a little bit north of there, that there's nothing there, because there is a park in the middle there. You've got a sign that's going in by the park. There's a little walkway that goes to that park. It just seems awkward to me that as heavily walked and biked as that little area is, that we don't have anything between essentially almost all the way up to Beckman Road through to the high school and Beckman Creek middle school there, or primary school.
did forget to mention that all of the wayfinding signage for bicycling has already been installed as the previous plan. So the point of our little toppers was to try to tie in the brand to those existing signs. But those are not part of the phase strategy. Those are just as you have money and you have maintenance guys that can run out and put a topper on top of a sign, you know, have them do it. It's pretty low cost thing to get out and add. You can just have a kind of machine shop produce a bunch of the signs for you, and you can get those out.
Good.
Really quick.
I just, you know, because Villebois does have wayfinding signage, but Meadows is a big neighborhood and does not. And so it's kind of devoid of signs there if we don't do a little something over there.
So is the comment that you would like to see pedestrian signs in the Meadows neighborhood?
Yeah, well, or at least on the exterior of it along Wilsonville Road.
In line with that, I think we might include signage to trailheads.
Yeah.
Including in that neighborhood.
Yeah.
Beckman Creek Trail. And of course, we will have a trail in Frog Pond.
And I think there is some signage that speaks to the, is it Beckman or the Canyon crossing, that little, that goes from the Courtside neighborhood through to that, that's an excellent point, because that's right in the middle of the Meadows neighborhood as well. And I think it'd be a good idea if people understand you can get from Meadows over to the Courtside neighborhood.
Yeah. There is signs, but they're hard to see. Yeah.
Yes.
Well, when you're right there, there's a sign, but there's no sign to there.
Yeah, there's no sign on Wilsonville Road that tells you to go this way to go get to that crossing.
Yeah, or on Canyon Creek Road.
All right, that's all I got.
Okay.
I think.
I want to concur with the preference for the compound curve on the wave. And I also I'm actually going to throw my weight around a little on this. Not as chair, but I have a doctorate in readability. The subject of my doctoral dissertation was readability, and I want to declare that the stacked double line is actually more readable.
So he said,
Yes. Hey, Chris, I think I'm just going to resign from the commission now because I've gotten so many accolades. I think it's more than like the 8 years I've been here. So I'm just going to finish. We're done.
Meeting adjourned. All in favor?
Beginning of a new trend, Commissioner Early.
But I very much do like the curved motif, especially in its compound form. And I very much do like a rock base. I did not like the Gambian at all. But this treatment is tasteful and also, I think, durable.
Mm-hmm.
Can I ask a question, just not to derail the whole thing, but is there any community around us, another city that has something similar? Like, are we kind of stepping on somebody's toes or creating confusion?
Chris pointed out that there was a Clackamas, was it Clackamas Community College, or was it?
Where did I see that?
You saw one.
It was during a baseball tournament this summer. I was off in some random place, and I believe it was in Clackamas.
But it's not like a whole city has this.
It was just
like
kind of one prominent corner was what I noticed.
Yeah.
I'm not aware of any citywide Corten. Have you offered this package to other communities?
I have not. We have not.
Will you?
No. We try very hard to make sure that everything is unique. This was, by the way, another Corten example. The
columns in the river.
Exactly. This was probably the thing that hit us first when we were looking through the photography.
Yeah, cool.
Any other comments?
I just wanted one for clarification. and this one I need a little help on in regards to the schools, but I was thinking that having periods between, so like for primary school, P period, S period, just thinking of somebody who comes into, looking at that, thinking, am I supposed to figure out something from this? And then the other is just calling it Smart Transit Center, so Smart T.C. Because that's pretty common within the metro area, just to call it a transit center.
Either Wilsonville Transit Center or Smart Transit.
Either one, yeah. And actually, to be honest, Wilsonville TC, I think is, yeah, because again, you come here from someplace else. What's Smart TC? I don't know. Trade college.
You got transit centers in other communities.
Right. Yeah.
And if it's the only transit center, can we just call it transit center for the abbreviated version?
Yeah. It's not a bad idea.
Okay.
Sure.
And for tech corners, should we just strike that completely?
I think we should regard that as an emergent idea. It still has to emerge.
Yeah, I like the thought of potentially doing employment districts. And so if we do end up having 3 distinct employment districts, okay, well, let's name them and then we can put wayfinding signs to them. But we don't have that right now, so let's
strike it for now.
Brakes a little bit. Yeah.
OIT is an important landmark, and tech businesses can identify themselves as being in the OIT neighborhood.
Yes, true.
Okay.
One real quick one on the schools. I was wondering whether it made sense to separate Wilsonville High and Beckman Primary, and same thing for Wood Middle School and Boons Ferry. I mean, if you say Wilsonville High, does everybody just automatically know that Beckman is next to it? And same thing with Wood and Boons Ferry. So I think if we're going to call out the schools, we should call out all of them, not just some of them.
Okay.
So that would probably mean art tech would go on there as well?
That one's actually under a lease agreement, so I'd be hesitant to do that because they will likely have a permanent long-term home at some point in the future.
Fair enough.
In which case we will sign to that location.
Okay.
Yeah, but it's a lot smaller.
Yeah.
Anything else? I think that
excellent. Thank you very, very much. Really helpful.
Thank you.
Appreciate it. Thank you, Mary. We have a couple citizens. I don't know if you guys have anything you'd like to offer, and I'm sorry to dive right in, but since you're welcome to make a few comments if you'd like. You can come up. You have to come up. Yes. And if you don't want to say your name and address, I'd have you fill out a card and just provide that to Paula, please.
Where do I sit?
Right at the mic, yeah. Step right up.
Sign anything before she can sit?
No, we'll have you fill it out after.
I'm not alone anymore.
Hi.
Hi.
I'm Angela. And so on the sign topper, I agree that it should be a little bit smaller, and I wonder if we strike welcome to also on those?
We debated that, and everybody really loved the welcome to. What is the general consensus? Strike it?
I think welcome to is okay, but we don't need Oregon, and I think we can shorten it both horizontally and vertically a little bit.
I think welcome is a good message. We're a welcoming community.
Except for me.
Except for him. Yeah.
I'm okay. Yeah. I'm okay with welcome too. I'm good with it.
Actually, I don't know how far we could squeeze it down because the arch is kind of free space that the welcome to fills up.
Sure.
But yeah, I think that's a really good point.
Shrinking it horizontally, it's going to kind of look like Napoleon's hat.
Yeah, it needs to match the sign width.
That sounds awesome.
Some others.
Not on the sign topper. On the big horizontal sign, I wonder if the logo is necessary. I wonder if the logo is necessary next to Wilsonville. I don't necessarily visually like it there, but I agree that it should be on the sign over the stone, so I'm wondering if it needs to be there at all.
Smaller, like up in a corner, maybe?
I don't know.
I can make it brief either way myself. It has the advantage of identifying very clearly that that is our logo, and it ties in with our letterheads and all the other places where the logo appears. It does seem to me to mess up the sign, a little awkward.
Yeah.
I kind of liked the
clean.
I kind of liked the idea of having it attached to the stone just in case it changed in the next few years.
Hey, it was acquired through blood, sweat, and tears, though.
You weren't here when we last changed.
I was not. I got to hear a little bit about it.
Okay.
I waited to do this project 2 years while they did the logo, just because I said I was going to incorporate it into this program. So there's that too.
So maybe smaller and more like a postage stamp kind of up on.
There was another sign you
Possibly
had the
not on the
logo
same
a little
line with the
smaller.
type.
Yeah, like these signs, we have them tiny, sitting at the top on the kiosk and the park sign. And then I want to.
One is small. in the
Yeah,
corner.
see, that's what I thought is in the corner.
Not on
Okay.
the same
It's
line.
not as dominating there.
Perfect.
It adds a design element. I think if you put it on the base, attach it to the base, that's just,
It's lost.
It's long.
no, it's just going to invite vandalism for those who don't like it.
That's a good point.
Knock it off, you know?
So it sounds like everybody's in favor of a logo located kind of like that.
Does this fit here because Oregon has made a comeback on this sign?
This was one of the tested.
Oregon appears on this welcome sign, but I don't think it was written on the.
It's not on the other one.
Yeah, but it makes space for the logo to go underneath because you
Still put it underneath, yeah.
Yeah. So I didn't like Oregon on the sign topper, but I would be okay with Oregon on the welcome
On the gateway?
gateway.
Especially if it gives a new line, a new base for the logo to sit on. Yes.
Yeah, right. Yeah.
Better stop asking.
Thank you. That's a very helpful observation.
That's all. All right.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Appreciate it.
All right, I think I've got everything documented.
And I can have Paula's notes sent to you here as soon as we get them, and we'll have it all typed out for you, and so
That'd be
make sure
awesome.
you have comprehensive notes.
Was she taking tally of all the?
Tally marks.
All right.
Thank you. Appreciate it very much. Thanks.
If there's nothing else, then that is our work session. We have the action minutes from council. I assume that you've all studied them assiduously. Are there any questions or comments to take back to council? I'm finding these action minutes very helpful, actually more helpful than the in-person reports from the councilors. Yeah. And then we have our marching orders for the remainder of the year.
Chris, do you really think that we're going to be ready for a public hearing for the town center plan in January? Or Miranda, since Miranda's still here as well?
That's why it says tentative.
It is penciled in as tentative, and we will see where our work sessions in November take us.
Okay. It feels like there might need to be one more work session in addition to what you've got on here.
I would agree with that. It'll probably be, the work session will probably be January. We're hoping to have the draft plan in November, but in discussions with the consultant, based on the prioritization we have to go through, I don't think that's possible. And so what you'll see is revised versions of the stuff that we're still working on with you, and anywhere where we've kind of reached full dialogue on, you'll see final versions. But that will mostly be in kind of the technical appendices and attachments or individual chapters. So my guess is you'll see the full plan with all those revisions that you discussed with us in November and January.
Okay.
And then that will be a work session, and then we'll head to hearing. But
Okay.
good question.
We removed French Ferry Bridge, probably on my suggestion, because there wasn't much, but I see now there's a design proposal open house coming up. That's this month, right?
I believe that is going to be posted either this week or next week.
I think it's posted.
Open house?
Yeah, I think it's posted. I just can't remember when it is. Perhaps Chris knows. So there is an open house coming up.
Yes.
And at that open house, there'll be, I think, 3 or possibly 5 design alternatives with the idea that it's going to be refined to a smaller number to take to the city council. So I think, the other commissioners might be interested in checking that open house out. Chris, we're talking about you.
Well, it's
the
French Prairie Bridge project. The digital open house is opening this week. Is that correct?
Yes.
Okay. So check that out.
I urge us all everyone who can, to come
Chair Greenfield, could you?
To the session at the theater tomorrow. I think that's very germane to us, and we ought not to miss it if we can avoid it. Is there anything else for the good of the order? In that case, we are adjourned at 9:11.
Thank you very much, Commission.